In this episode, I am joined by Alan Chapman, British writer, occultist, and spiritual teacher. Alan recalls his troubled childhood in the impoverished north of England, reflects on the British class system, and shares his first encounter with Aleister Crowley. Alan recounts his occult adventures with longtime collaborator Duncan Barford, shares his spiritual biography of awakenings and mystical experiences, and considers the power and pitfalls of spiritual transmission. Alan also compares gurus Papaji, Andrew Cohen, and Adyashanti, reveals why he considers Stephen Batchelor and Sam Harris to be black brothers, and discusses the role of the dark goddess on the path of awakening. So without further ado, Alan Chapman. Alan Chapman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Well, I'm so pleased to be speaking with you today. I've been a long admirer of your various writings and podcasts and so on, so it's a real pleasure to talk with you.
That's very flattering, thanks.
You've had quite an output of books and podcasts related to magic and awakening. Listeners will no doubt be familiar with your various podcasts and writing collaborations with Duncan Barford, who I mention because he's a previous guest of the podcast. I've interviewed Duncan 2-3 times now, and he's mentioned you. And also, you are the teacher, or you were the teacher, of Alex W., another podcast guest. So there's a little bit of intertextuality here going on, which makes it even more fun.
Yes. I'm surprised that the impression you take from my work is that there's a lot of it, because I always feel like I'm not producing enough. I'm sitting on a lot of material at the moment, but yes, it's been a privilege and one of the highlights of my life to work with Duncan. With the authors of the Baptist compendium. I'm sure Duncan would have mentioned it on your podcast. Oh, there we go. Yes. And that contains some of our exploits. And now we have a couple of podcasts. We did Warp FM, a 10-episode season, and now we've got another one, Passport Through Hades, which is where we discuss our ongoing work on editing the collected magical works of Aleister Crowley. And then briefly on Alex. Yes, Alex is the reason that I started teaching. He was my first student, and he invited me to guide him through the process that I describe, that I went through personally in the Baptist Head. He's a charming, brilliant man. Yeah, so I'm what can I say? It's also a privilege to have students of that caliber.
I'd like to begin with your early life, actually, your childhood. I'm curious about the context of your upbringing. I know in your teenage years you became very interested in Crowley, and so things went on from there. But even before that, I'm curious about your sort of family of origin.
I grew up in the north of England. I grew up as impoverished as you can be in this country. So I grew up on a council estate, single parent. And I think the circumstances of one's birth, they can speak to something else that's going on under the surface that might be necessary, such that whilst living it, you might wonder, like, what kind of evil genius could concoct such a situation and subject you to it, and how might you escape it? But I think that there's another angle to it, which is the nature of incarnation provides us with material necessary for us to produce the kind of treasure or gold from that experience that's unique to that particular path in life. What the function of an incarnation might be. So for me, I very much felt like I was held in place. There was a sense that my circumstances forced me to be insular, or rather, I might say self-reliant. So there was no opportunity where I lived. There was no way out. And I mean, you mentioned Crowley my teenage years, but he came earlier than that. So I remember I went to a Church of England school, and I remember hearing about Christ, Jesus Christ. So let's say I'm 6 or something like that, and we're being told these stories about Christ. And I had the most peculiar reaction to hearing the description of the nature of Christ as the incarnation of God, which was a sense of wanting to experience reality from that perspective. Of course, I wouldn't use this language at the time, but I was attracted to that possibility, let's say. And then as the years went by, I steadily learned that, of course, there's only one Christ in history. There won't be another. And then saints, they were human beings who could come to know God, even if they didn't have the same nature. But apparently they didn't exist anymore either. So I think by the time I was 9, that's when, through sheer luck, we might say, a boy down the road, he bought a computer game, and a free novel came with that game, and he gave it to me because I was the only person he knew who read books. And it was a fantasy novel, and it had there were magicians in there and wizards. And reading the story, it resonated with me. So there were characteristics of, like, the main protagonist that were similar to my personality, if you like, and circumstance in life. But the magician sounded very much like a saint, or even like Christ. They're figures who have been initiated into a deeper understanding of the nature of reality, in some sense. And so I became preoccupied, as one does at that age, with these fantasy stories. But of course, I knew that they were fantasy stories. And then one day in the playground, in a book of ghost stories, I turned the page, and there was Aleister Crowley. So I must have been about 9 years old. And there's Aleister Crowley's head, with a black snake wrapped around it, reminiscent of the Orphic egg. And it was the tabloid version. So it would be the most repulsive and dissuasive manner in which the reality of magic could be presented to someone. The stories about torturing animals, sacrificing children, that kind of a thing. And I remember distinctly being repulsed by the story, but simultaneously thrilled that here was a hint that magic was real, and that adults believed that it was real, and that it might be something in the world. Now there was an added factor, which is in the fantasy story, the hero of the story, he's being taken over by the most evil wizard that's ever existed in the past. Right, he's trying to take over his body in the present. That's part of the storyline. And I remember seeing Crowley and thinking, oh no, is he going to try and take over my body? And I suppose in a sense he did. But it started then. That was my introduction to Crowley. It's something, this magic is something that's real. And I knew I'd found what I was looking for, even though I didn't understand it. And actually, worse than that, it was completely dissuasive. It was completely dissuasive, but I knew that that's, there's something here. And I then went to secondary school. I go through the socialization process. I become conscious of my position in society, if you like. So it was a depressing period. By the time I get to about 15, I'm what can I say? I'm presented with the only avenue in life, which is, the consumerist materialist perspective. That seemed to be what my peers were into. It seemed to be, what the prevailing view that a mature adult would adopt. Right? Anything else is just, unreasonable and silly, something like that. And that's when I came across Aleister Crowley's Magic in Theory and Practice, unfortunately not in a dusty old magic shop run by a bearded pipe smoking wizard, but just an end of the run publishing outlet. So it's gaudy cookbooks and that kind of a thing, and novels or whatever. And bizarrely, there's this run of Magic in Theory and Practice. Of course, I had the exact change in my pocket for the book. It was very cheap. And it was an ordeal for me to pick up the book and go and buy it because I was afraid of what the cashier might think of me as a 15-year-old buying a book about magic, which of course is very silly and immature. But again, with the book, you read Magic and Theory and Practice. I don't know if you've read it. I read it, didn't understand a word of it, but it was the same. It was the same phenomenon again, which is I know I found what I'm looking for, even though it's completely dissuasive. Something that my society would say is evil and perhaps insane. And and the warnings against pursuing magic is something that I've come across a number of times in my career. You might say with good cause. But that's how I got into Crowley. I ended up trapped on my council estate. I got a job filling bags with soil for £10 a day. And I would save up my money and then go to Manchester to New Aeon Books, which was a magic shop run by wizards. And I would buy works by Crowley. So I spent about 2 years just reading Crowley and trying to work out practices from his veiled instructions. And I did a particular magical working to find a more accessible means of practicing magic. And that's when I came across chaos magic. I practiced magic privately with no one knowing about it till I was about 25. Because I knew I was pursuing something that I was interested in, but I couldn't explain it to anyone else. Nor did I want to. So I just kept it to myself. It's like tending a little flame and keeping it guarded so that it wouldn't be extinguished, something like that. And when I was 25, that's when I moved to London and joined the Illuminates of Thaneteros, and that's where I met Duncan Barford.
You mentioned that your friend knew that you were the only boy who knew that read books.
Yeah.
So it makes me curious as to what kind of boy you were at that time, and I'm also curious about this socialization process and what place it is in society you became conscious was yours.
I was, what can I say? I was good at drawing, so people used to give me attention for drawing pictures. I read books, so I was the only boy in my class who you might say had any kind of academic success in the classroom. I went to the kind of school where some boy had decided he was going to beat me up, and I could never understand why he'd want to hurt anyone. I couldn't understand that. But this boy attacked me. I protected myself, and then I got into trouble for bullying. And they made a point at the end of the school of giving out academic awards. There were lots of girls who got awards, and they said, and usually this year there was one boy who will get an award, but he can't have it because he's a bully. And they didn't give it to me. That was the kind of school. It was the kind of school where the teacher might swing you around by your hair if you were naughty, if you were bad. It was rough. I like to think when I was a kid, I was what can I say? I mean, these things are only ever going to sound self-serving, aren't they? But I like to think I was a compassionate, kind kid. I couldn't. I mentioned how I couldn't understand how you'd want to hurt someone, but I couldn't understand why you would want to. I remember being with a friend, and there was a tree, and absent-mindedly he went up to it was like a sapling. He went up to the sapling and went to snap it in half, and I stopped him from doing it because I couldn't understand why he'd want to kill the tree. That kind of thing. Yeah. So open-minded, kind, friendly. That's what I like to think. Socialization was then realizing that I became aware of economic status, class status during the socialization process. That's what you become aware of. I became aware that I didn't wear the right clothes, that my mother bought me clothes from the flea market, from a secondhand stalls or whatever. That where I lived was a deprived area. We didn't go on holidays. We didn't have a car. that kind of thing. And all the people that I was situated with because of my what can I say, doing academically well at school, that my friends tended to be middle class kids. So it was a stark, there was a contrast there that was painful. But again, I reflect on it now and I see that there is from the beginning up until now, it's as if my circumstances were such that I was just held in place and forced to go in one direction. And I can speak more to that when I talk about some of my spiritual biography in terms of realizations, that kind of a thing.
You've described there a very rough kind of environment and that kind of cruel wielding of authority that one hears about in schools. And but also you've described yourself as, I mean, would you say a sensitive boy?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
How do those two things go together? How did you navigate the rough environment and that sort of cruelty, etc., with your sensitive nature?
Well, I can spot danger from a great distance away. I do sometimes marvel at how what can I say? It's obvious to me that I can tell when danger's happening or where someone's about to get violent in a way that people that I've been friends with over this, once I went to college, say they didn't seem to have the same self-awareness as that kind of a thing. So I think you end up being, you know how to stay away. You can read how people are going to behave, and there is an element of you being able to defend yourself that creeps in there. But I've come to it's something that you might wrestle with, the idea that you have to be realistic about the nature of the world. But is that a trap? Is that a way of you poisoning something that shouldn't be poisoned? Is there circumstances forcing you to do something that in terms of your conscience, you wouldn't want to do otherwise? And it can be very easy to lean into that in that direction. And in fact, you'd be encouraged to do it. So if someone picks on you at school, the response is you're supposed to fight them back. That's what you're supposed to do. You should defend yourself. I still have sympathy with that view. Being walked over constantly by what can we say, thugs, people who are ignorant, that kind of a thing. And then there's other ways in which people do it as well, psychologically. They might not be overtly physically violent, but they're more dishonest in the way that they're psychologically, what can we say? Psychologically bullying. We can use that as a so like the equivalent might be, what I need to do is I need to get like the other people who are middle class, and then I can sneer at the poor people. Something like that, right? That's how you succeed. You become violent, either physically or economically, you might say. Although I've never used that language before, and that's what you need to do in terms of the hierarchy, in terms of society. But there's a cost, isn't there? There's something you can lose that child that you used to be as a result of that. Now there does need to be a process of growing up and maturing. You can't stay in that state of naivety. And you shouldn't confuse wisdom with naivety, even though they can look similar. But at the same time, you can lose a part of yourself going through those experiences, and be persuaded by appearances that that's actually the appropriate thing to do. Yes, that's I think that's the best I've got.
Did that happen to you?
I'm not sure. I mean, it took the circumstance that led to me, the story about someone physically attacking me, was a result of someone day in, day out for 4 years, physically assaulting me until it got to the point where I just lost it. And it took a long time to get there, and I was intensely, deeply sorry for that. It's something that at the time it happened, and then obviously I've had years of practice of various different stripes, but at some point I came to uncover the fact that there was a deep sadness and a deep sorrow and regret for doing that, which surprised me, going back to when I was 9 and feeling what can I say? It was like an unforgivable sin that I'd done that. So I mean, you always find that acquiring these shadows, we might say, as we mature, as our incarnation deepens, they always cost us something personally meaningful. The appropriate thing is not to it's not even to worry about avoiding those circumstances, because you can't. But there is the question around whether or not you travel back into that darkness to recover what was lost. And I think that's part of that process of maturing as a human being.
Was the regret to do with hurting the boy or betraying your own nature?
Well, one's own nature is something that is in the best case scenario unconsciously expressed. There's no if one's self-aware of it, or you're self-conscious, you might even say overconscious of it, you have to question whether or not there's been some kind of pathological development there. One's nature is how it is, and it's effortlessly expressed. That's what success looks like. That's what it means to be a human being. That's what it means to fulfill what it is that you've come here to do as a human being. So I would say that's true whether we're talking about a more profound nature or just the simple nature of a little boy or whatever. And I think the regret is part of that. So we might say, how did I know to feel regret for doing that? What makes that possible? What informed it? And it's something that must come prior, that allows you to navigate that, to even make it possible in the first place. So I wouldn't say it was a conscious betrayal, or rather a recognition that it was merely just this, a sad fact, that I'd done something, and it didn't matter what the other person had done. I'd just done something, and it was I was deeply sorry. These are interesting questions, by the way. No one's ever asked me these questions. Yeah. Is your audience interested in this kind of thing?
I'm following my interest in this conversation, really. And I'm not playing to particularly a sense of what the audience will find interesting. And in my experience, anyway, if I'm finding it interesting and we're finding it interesting together, then others will. But there's no particular need for it to be appealing to anybody other than the two of us.
Yeah. But this is what you normally do. You explore biography in a I'll back up and put it another way. It's interesting that you're concerning yourself with details that might not necessarily be obvious to explore when it comes to say the topic of awakening or something like that. Usually it's what practice do you do? What tradition are you in? Tell us about your realizations. And the mundane stuff tends to be, what can we say? It can be easily overlooked, can't it? Because it doesn't look like what it is that we're interested in.
Right. That's right. I think you're right about that. And there are a couple of motives guiding it. Why am I interested in it? Well, a couple of things. Having reviewed your output, including interviews you've done, you haven't done very, very many interviews, but you've done some. This is not covered. And in addition to that, these sorts of early experiences depends on what they are. I mean, some people's early experiences don't seem to be that influential, really, later on, at least not obviously so. But I think your experiences are quite telling. And also your particular analysis, the way your mind works, the way you pick things apart, and the way you've gone over this material, evidently, is of interest to me as well, which is what leads to my next question. But if you've got a response to what I've said, then by all means.
No, it's great. Segue in.
Okay. So, sidling in, you mentioned class, social position.
Yes.
So not everybody knows about class, British class system, and I think even some British people haven't really articulated it. although many British people are, I think, very informed by it. And it also changes, I think, over time, different decades and so on. The structure of it changes a bit.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might take us back to that point and describe the class system, if you like, this structure in British society. And if you might articulate perhaps some of the, I think each level of that class system tends to have certain, mantras and phrases and so on that are definitive of their self-identity in relationship to the other levels.
I mean, I'll probably do a disservice as a survey of the system. But in terms of how it actually mattered to me, what it actually meant. I mean, so briefly, there's opportunities tied to economic possibility. As in, if you don't have any money, there are things that you can't do. Now, this might be obvious in every society. It's an obvious fact, isn't it? If you don't have money, you can't do things. In British society, there is, however, the binding up of identity with that, and a cultural expression that goes along with it, such that if one is at a certain economic class, it's appropriate, and you are with your people, with your customs at that level. And therefore your opportunities should be, you should adjust your expectations in terms of opportunity accordingly. And this isn't just merely a what can we say? A superficial view of things that we're supposed to go along with. It is also, a deeply embedded, expressed cultural fact. So much so that, I mean, my experience has been, miraculously, I managed to move out of the class that I was in into another class. However, as someone British, you always know you can't leave the class that you came from. Your accent, mannerisms, attitudes to certain things betray your upbringing, your breeding, if you like. Yes. But there's another curious fact about my biography, which is I've always find myself neither one thing nor another. I'm always on the line or the edge of something. So I grew up poor, but my father was middle class. I didn't really have anything to do with my father, but he did live in a big house next to my school. So I got to see the difference between the two things. What can we say? Contrasted on most days at secondary school. My mother was Welsh. My father was English. Living in England, we were always considered Welsh. I lived in Wales for a while. I was always considered English. The children on the council estate where I grew up, they used to say we talked posh. I've got a twin brother, non-identical. We were called the Posh Twins, which is insane when you think about it, right? But it speaks to the class thing. It's because our accents were obviously informed by my mother and must have been to some extent by my father, but we talked different from everyone else. And so it's like I'm not poor when I'm with the poor people, but then I'm poor when I'm with the middle class people, and so on and so on. It's always, even when I did chaos magic, I joined the IoT. I don't really do chaos magic because I'm interested in awakening. But in non-duality circles, I'm not really into non-duality because I do magic. There's this constant, finding myself straddling two things, and not belonging to either. Yeah. So in terms of what matters in terms of me viewing my past is that I can see that there was whatever avenue I may have been seduced by that's normally available to people wasn't available. And that's the important thing. That's the important thing, if that makes sense. So I couldn't fall into the secular materialist thing because it wasn't available to me. I'm losing that game if I try and play that game. And where people often say the lower working class or the working class are like the salt of the earth. You must have heard that. Yes. I grew up surrounded by the honest, open. They were honest and open, right? Really honest. If they're going to punch you in the face, they'll punch you in the face, right? Then there's an honesty to that. There was nothing manipulative or, duplicitous about how the way people behaved. But I was surrounded by thugs and ignorant people. Then when I moved into the middle class, if you like, I found that those people would profess to care about poorer people, but really they shared the same view. And and then the middle classes have their own problem, which is you've been provided with everything and you've achieved nothing, but then that breeds resentment and a rejection of the system. It's another, what can I say, expression of the same thing. I've known people who are upper class, right? They have their own thing going on. It's what can I say? I don't have the same. I often don't share the same kind of resentments based on the class that I encounter. Again, it's not a. I find myself not belonging to anything in that regard. There's a lot of nonsense in our society, which is why wouldn't you want to be happily married with children and create something to hand down to them so that they can have a good future? I don't know why you wouldn't aim to do that. In British culture, we don't just have the class system, we also have this culture of continually tearing people down, continually doing that, regardless of whatever class you might be in. Apart from in the upper class, they seem to understand this and they stay where they're at for that reason. Yeah, I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want my children to grow up the way I grew up, and I have concerns like, oh no, they're going to grow up middle class. Oh, they'll have they won't know what it means to have to navigate the dangers of the world. But at the same time, it's like good. I'm glad. Yeah, I don't know. That's probably a pretty basic overview of social class. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that's very well put. It's interesting that you didn't feel quite at home in your own class, so to speak, so you couldn't really reside there.
Yeah.
But nor could you pass in any other. So you were presumably that dislocation gave you a bit more mobility.
Yeah, it's always the same. I think it just comes back to the same thing. There's this path I have to walk down, and I'm just held in place, and there's no time for cul-de-sacs or being seduced by spending time doing something else. There's just a straight road, and that's what I need to get on with.
Yeah, that's interesting. Where did music come into all of this?
Yeah, so the frustration at being held in place would come to be expressed in a number of ways, which was at one point I thought maybe the road out of where I was with art. I used to do a lot of drawing when I was a kid and I was good at it. Maybe I should do that. I studied that for a little bit, got disillusioned with the academic route with art. Became more about talking about it than actually doing anything. And the stuff that I did was wholly derivative, from the usual suspects, Austin Osman Spare, and so on. Music, I started playing guitar when I was 16, let's say. Like I had a bunch of friends. They were all in a band together, but I wasn't in the band. They didn't need me in the band. Again, it's the similar thing. It's a similar situation. But I played guitar, and then it would turn out that the music, as idealistic and romantic as I was as a young man, that might be the road out of where I am. I know I'll move to London and become a rock star. Right, but it's just a thinly veiled bait to get me to move to London. I moved to London, and I played guitar, but then I started writing songs. I thought I can't write a song. I can play guitar, but I can't write songs. And then I did a lot of gigging in London, but the places I would play, I was mainly playing to other people trying to do the same thing. Meanwhile, I secretly, because I've been practicing magic this entire time and meditation and so on, I joined the IoT. I meet Duncan. We start doing the Baptist head stuff. I'm not even thinking about that stuff as what can we say, an avenue to anything. It's just something that I'm doing with him. And then roundabout when I'm about 28, something like that, after Advanced Magic for Beginners came out, my first book, and I'm going through this process of waking up that I describe in the Baptist Head, I became aware that I was placing an existential burden, misplacing an existential burden on my identity as a musician. Or you could swap out musician and just say vocation. And I think a lot of people do this, particularly men do this. You think about your career or what you do in your life as of primary importance. It tells you who you are and what your value is, and without it you have no value. And that, to the extent that it's the thing that you think provides you with the understanding of who and what you are, it's misplaced. And once I'd realized that, a lot of the desperation that might feed the pursuit of a particular kind of career, you recognize, that desperation is for something else. It's a longing for something else. And this is a candidate that I've mistaken for what it is that I'm most interested in. And about 2008, something like that, when I'm 28, I sort of became aware of that, and it started to fall away to a certain extent. And then in 2009, at the culmination of the Baptist Head work, I went traveling the world and met a guru in Tiruvannamalai in India, a guy called Arunachala Ramana. And sitting in his presence is when I had an awakening. It came at the opportune time. It wasn't random, out of nowhere. It's exactly where you would expect that degree of realization to happen in terms of the traditional, description of the terrain. And that's when a reorganization of how I operated in the world was required. Recognizing that my impulses, they've been aimed at the wrong target. Some of those things, yeah. I've since come back round to music, but in a different way, in a very different way.
I suppose you're talking about Shedding Feathers, your 2025. You've released an album, haven't you? Morning Chorus this year, right?
I did. Actually, it was actually released the year before, but it got taken down and then put back up again, so it looks like it came out this year. I mean, bizarrely, how do I move into this? Because now we're sort of moving back to the end. So one way of understanding the path of the process is that you keeping your eyes on what you long for, that is nevertheless non-apparent, right? It exists over the horizon of your experience, no matter how profound your experience might be. If you keep your eyes in that direction, everything that you might consider to be personally fulfilling will come along and be fully realized, right? Peculiar to your own nature, precisely because you don't care about it, right? And it manifests in a frictionless manner. So I could give you numerous examples of this, but the music is an example of it, one of the examples of it. So just a couple of years ago, I found these old demos. I thought, I have like 1% of my time I could spend on music. I will. I had a student who was a metal producer, and he offered to produce an album with me. And I thought, I have enough time to do that. I went down for maybe like 10 days in total. In the end, recorded some vocals and guitar or whatever. And then he did a wonderful job of producing, mixing, and mastering the album. Then I did absolutely nothing with it, because I had no time to do anything. I wasn't making music videos or anything like that. And there was no existential burden in terms of that music. It didn't mean anything. It doesn't define who and what I am. Nothing's riding on it, so to speak. But it just sat there. And then someone offered, a friend, student, but out of the blue at the time, just offered to do a remix of one of the songs. and it got remixed and then released as a trance record. I got a record deal basically by doing nothing, and it was in the top 10 on Beatport. This is the best new trance for April 2025. That happened this year. I mean, it's amusing and surreal, you know, but it's an example of it. The you know, and it's in its appropriate place. You know, I'm not trying to win a Grammy or anything like that. It's merely a part of that effortless expression of one's nature. You know, and the fact that there's no misplaced burden on it means that it gets to be expressed frictionlessly, so it comes along easy, and it will go easy. You know, yeah. I mean, I can think of another daft example, which is I went through a period when I was a teenager where I was into Bruce Lee, right? And I always wanted to learn original Jeet Kune Do, Bruce Lee's martial art. And I did a similar thing a couple of years ago. I thought, you know what? I will find a teacher who teaches the original stuff and just do a little, weekend thing, like a bucket list exercise. And I found the guy, went on his website, and then lo and behold, he had a student who'd become a teacher, and he was 10 minutes from my house. So I could go and learn this extraordinarily niche, rare martial art 10 minutes from my house where I lived. It's little things like that. Yes. And and then there's, of course, it's all part of a mosaic. So there's a larger work, which is the stuff that I'm getting to do now with Aleister Crowley's work.
Which hasn't been entirely frictionless, we must admit.
It depends what we mean by frictionless. So shall I delve into that? Shall I talk about the Crowley work? We are skipping something in the middle that's obviously important to the biography.
We'll come back to that, but you're sort of
okay.
hitting this theme now, and these are examples of that theme, and then we'll retrace our steps.
Yes, I was invited by my publisher a year or two ago to work on a Crowley book. He said, Aleister Crowley's works are now out of copyright. Would you like to edit one of the works? Write an introductory essay, that kind of a thing. And I said, I'll do you one better. Let's do a 10-volume collected magical works set. We'll do that. But then I spent a year researching Crowley's life. So reading everything he's ever written, everything ever written about him. And it was a lot of work, and there was even a lot of suffering involved in doing it. However, the frictionless part was how I would travel through that, what I was following, and the nature in which the way in which the information came along was frictionless. It was given. So it doesn't mean no effort on one's part. When I talk about frictionlessness, the effort is also frictionless, right? It's sometimes painfully so, because it has the freedom to be what it is, right? To disclose its own nature. So you get to experience the depth of the suffering, perhaps in a way that you might not if you were caught up in it, right? But it doesn't mean the absence of suffering. It just means, the freedom for something to be what it is, to disclose its own nature fully. And it tends to mean that, like weather, it comes along and then it goes, and then something else comes along. But always your eyes are on something else, following this something else. So it was like excavation work. It was hard work, but the picture that emerged is a radically different picture of Crowley, and I cannot pretend that I sat around like a detective, exploring all these avenues to try and find details. One just came after another, and then the writing process was me. I would build up an image, start building it up, and then realize that's not deep enough yet, and then I'd have to dig the whole thing up, so to speak, and go a level deeper, and then do it again. And that's a process I'm familiar with. I spent a number of years before Magia came along, which is what I teach, doing this similar thing. And from the outside, it looks to people like you can't make your mind up or something like that. as if you're attempting to formulate something, and then you change your mind. You don't like it anymore, so you're going to do something else. When really what's happening is that part of this process is putting into words something that has to be put into words as a lower order expression of a higher process, right? That allows you to consciously participate in that process in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise. But it's a process of cultivation, which is why an agricultural analogy is the best way of understanding it. But you gather up, it's like gathering up the details, your understanding of it to a certain point to try and express it. It makes it conscious in such a way that you can see what's left out. I know there's more. I know that there's more yet. I know I've not reached the end yet. It's that curious sense of knowing you're not saying it yet, even though you don't know what it is and you've not seen it before. And one has to wonder, like, how do you have that sense? How do you know that what you're saying isn't what needs to be said, or isn't the right way of expressing it yet? That's what I did with the Magia book. It's also what I did with Crowley, but I was just following the same thing. So there was a phenomenal amount of work involved. This picture emerges. I put it together in this essay with all of the research, all of the receipts, so to speak. I wanted it to be academically rigorous, so that there's no doubt about the image, you know, that's appeared. We put the book together. I roped Duncan into helping me edit the letters. He did a phenomenal job. And the book was approaching print. And then the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, for people who don't know who they are, they're like the Crowley equivalent of Scientology. They turned up to stop the book from appearing by claiming the copyright, which it probably could have been challenged in court, but probably doesn't work out logistically to do that financially or something like that. So anyway, so the book was cancelled and didn't come out, and so we're left wondering, well, what's going to happen with the book? Now you might say, oh look, there's some friction. This isn't a frictionless path. However, the hallmark of someone following this path, following the path of awakening from whatever tradition, is that the events of the path demonstrate the content of the teaching. Right? So the events show the same thing that is described by the teaching. So case in point, briefly, Aleister Crowley's book, The Book of the Law, describes an underworld journey where the sun god Re goes into the underworld, and as a light appearing in the land of the dead, wakes up the dead, right? Presents them with a choice. You can either follow the light of consciousness, the god Re, you identify with the god, go with the god Re to create a new day, to continue creation, continue the light of consciousness, or you can attempt to extinguish it. You can decide enough is enough. This world needs to burn, down to the ground. We don't want any more of that. Two choices, but really it's the same path, because you have to travel through death, what's called the second death in the underworld, where your soul is judged. Right? Does it continue to eternal life, or is this the end? Is it annihilated forever? That's the choice. Now, the light also attracts the forces of darkness that want to extinguish the light of consciousness. And so there's a battle that's also involved. So at the end of a world and the beginning of a new one, there's this cosmic battle that occurs. Each individual is presented with a choice. And one way of thinking about that is that the entirety of creation is placed in the hands of the created. Do you continue with creation, or is it ended? And each of us gets that choice. And here's the interesting part. It's a very, very old ancient understanding, which is the usual conception that we have of the underworld, the land of the dead, is as somewhere that we go to after we've died as human beings. But the esoteric understanding is that this is actually the underworld. we're already dead. Real life belongs somewhere else, which is where we were before we came here. And we've lost that life, apparently, right? And this is why we find ourselves lost and confused. We don't know who and what we are, where we are, what the point of any of this is. As if existence is, the moving image of the absence of yourself. Who am I? What am I? I have to go and find those answers as if you're absent from yourself. That's what I need to do. Not only that, apparently you have a beginning and you're going to have an end. Everything has an end, right? Again, it's all the absence of any sense of being or what real life actually is. But you can also say as well that any life that is here must have been brought here from that other place. Now, that would then mean if we're in the underworld, right, that the second death is something we have to contend with here. It would also mean that we should also expect this, the end of a world and the beginning of another one to be happening here. And this battle between the forces of good and evil, consciousness and what can we say, unconsciousness, to be happening here. The appearance of this story about Aleister Crowley, the truth about the nature of the tradition that he belongs to, what was moving under the surface of his life, the nature of the Book of the Law. This is like the light appearing in the darkness to show you the structure of things, right? It's performative, so it's like demonstrating the content of the Book of the Law. So what should we expect? We should expect something to come along to extinguish the light, to put it out. Now, there's another detail in here, and this is described in the Book of the Law, is that the forces that do that always come dressed up in terms of reason and compassion. They're always the authority that claims to speak on behalf of the very thing that they're murdering, that they try and extinguish, and they always come dressed like that. And so this is what one should expect. So what we see is the frictionless unfolding of the content of the Book of the Law. It's demonstrating what it claims to be true for those that have eyes to see it, if you can recognize it. But that fact is something that you find in any authentic engagement with the lineage or the real life that I'm talking about from the other world. So spiritual biographies, if you pay attention, you'll see that the lives of realized beings or realized people, they demonstrate the content of what it is they've come to tell us. And there's this tendency that you see, which is in the beginning, someone going through the process of waking up and they begin teaching and so on, they will talk about themselves navigating the terrain in the way that anyone else does. And that's what they're doing. But later on in life, as they mature, they'll start to say curious things like, I was always awake. Or actually, I incarnated as a demonstration. It's just a demonstration. And that the content of their lives, if you follow it, it will show in real time, as a fact. It will validate what it is that they've come to tell us. And you see that over and over with biographies. I'm thinking of, one explicit example is Adyashanti. And that there's a leaving aside the question of the darkness of this world in the sense that human beings will have a pathological side that can come along for the ride, right? And I'm not saying this as a way of bypassing that stuff, but leaving that aside, if you look at a character like Adyashanti, he's not merely an egomaniac, right? There is an ambiguity about how he expresses what he's expressing. Is he an egomaniac, or is he expressing a profound truth? And his pronouncements about his incarnation being a demonstration, there is a deep truth to that. It's what you should look for if you want to know if something's authentic. Is not only that being exhibited, but the degree to which the person presenting the teaching is conscious of that fact. Does that make sense?
I'm following you, yes.
Yeah.
What's the difference between what you're saying and the common New Age idea that everything is working for my good, etc., etc., or that everything here is here to teach me a lesson in my ascension, etc.? I'm not saying they're equivalent terms, but
Yeah.
as an indicator of authenticity, which is how you've presented it, it
Yeah.
seems like the sort of thing that could be near enemies of that kind of understanding.
Yes, there is the choice between the two paths is essential. It's essential to recognize that, and it's a choice that's made over and over and over again. The fact of the matter is, this world is not providential, right? It's detrimental. It's destructive. It's like the first noble truth of the Buddha. You will lose everyone and everything that you care about, slowly deteriorate until you don't exist anymore. There's no way out of that, and nothing in this world will provide you with what it is that you're looking for. Despite the fact you might make the case of mistaken identity and think that it will do those things. It's why it takes some measure of experience before a lot of people realize that and then might pursue a path like Buddhism. So to that extent, incarnation, being a human being, a lived experience, if you're honest and you're willing to look reality in the face, it's unjust by definition. Unjust. However, right, that's if we just go with appearances. Now, most people stay there with appearances. Most people don't even recognize the unjust part. They're happy with their own false light in the world. They're happy to entertain that. There's something else, though. There's something else that you can follow that isn't an appearance. There's something else that comes prior. There's something else that has to come prior, otherwise there is no path to speak of. So it's wholly possible for people to say they're interested in awakening, or whatever the tradition might be, to wear the right clothes, say the right words, and do all these things, and it's completely superficial, right? You cannot judge the potential of a tree to produce a fruit, right, by appearances. If you're a gardener, you can't do that, so you have to give everything equal opportunity to perhaps produce a fruit. And sometimes those fruits come from unexpected places, right? So if people aren't getting it, I'm actually talking from the perspective there of being a teacher with students. People think they know what's required to wake up. Maybe someone has to be intelligent. Maybe someone has to be from a certain economic class. Maybe, they have to look a certain way, do certain things, say certain things, whatever it might be. Yes, you cannot tell by appearances. When one says yes to something else, though, that isn't an appearance, something that comes prior, something that is the reason why you learn all these words and do all these practices in the first place, right? What a Magia would call a silent knowing. It's that longing for the truth. We could say the truth. Sometimes you don't express it that way. Like, I don't really care what the truth is. I want to know who and what I am, because that's the same thing as being who and what I am. And I feel my absence, right? Or I feel your absence. I feel the absence. So there's a longing. I think the more apt analogy is thinking of that which we're seeking for as the beloved, right? When you fall in love with someone and you want to be with someone, it's not because you care about the truth of that person. I don't think you would put it that way. It's like, okay, that might be in there, the truth of the person, but it's to be with that person. Do you know what I mean? Whether you know what the truth is or not, it's like it's an intoxicating madness that I'm in love with this person, and I can't tell you why. It's just the way that it is, and I'll do anything for it to be the case. But how can we be here with a longing for a beloved that we've never fallen in love with before? How's that possible? So this is what I mean by a silent knowing. It's a knowing of something being absent. You've never encountered it in this world, to then miss it. And it's unexpressed. That's why it's silent. And you could think of the path through your life as the putting into words or the speech required, necessary. It's necessary, for that unfolding to take place, for us to be conscious of it. We don't put it into words, we can't be conscious of it. Putting it into words is part of creation. Creation has a purpose. It's not just an accident. But it requires these two worlds. The world that I talked about that is unjust, and then there must be another one that is completely just. It's the opposite. It's completely just. What would be just? It would be being with the beloved. That would be just. We can talk about wisdom, we can talk about beauty, you can talk about all of these things. But you're gonna need these two things, right, to explain the situation that you find yourself in. And then obviously there's this choice. So which one do you follow? Following the silent knowing often means traveling through dissuasive appearances. So in my own biography, I was talking about how my culture would have laughed at the idea of magic. It's even dressed itself up as magic, right, with Aleister Crowley's face. So right, you're going to go in that direction, and everything says you shouldn't go in that direction. Your culture says you shouldn't do it. You're on your own if you're going to do that. So often it looks dissuasive. And therefore we can think of these choices, these key choices that come along, as tests. It's like a test. To the extent that it's like a test, right, is the extent to which you've failed it, right? An opportunity comes along, and let's say I don't buy the Crowley book. Let's say I remain embarrassed at the very thought of it. And let's say I don't know, go to university and become an architect. I don't know, whatever, right? A secular rationalist, because that's what grown-up people like. Then it was a test and I failed it, right? And there's nothing providential there. There's nothing providential about that outcome, but it's a choice I can make. And I could even go, if I choose to indulge appearances and then my own shadows, particularly around the sense of injustice and getting revenge, right? And the resentment that comes along with it. If I indulge that, there is a darker cultivation that's possible. I can go in an even darker direction. You might say, if we thought of this world as a forest, it's like going deeper into the forest where it's even darker. We can go in that direction. However, if we say yes to that silent knowing and follow that instead, that's like following a thread that leads out of this forest, the darkness of the forest. It leads up the mountain, right, to the house of God. And it's a golden thread. And we can follow that instead. The moment you do that, now your eyes are on something else. The moment you do that, suddenly, the means of your binding, the means of your damnation, the unjust world, becomes the means of your liberation, becomes the means of your unbinding. Suddenly then, everything, you can look back on your life and say, it couldn't have been otherwise. And every detail is precisely the way that it is. It couldn't have been otherwise, because it's providential, right? And what I'm now experiencing is the unfolding of this eternal destiny, or this being, this real life, this eternal life, who and what I really am. And it's happening here, right? It's not happening in some vague nebulous realm somewhere else. It's happening here as a human being in the middle of the darkness. That's where it's happening. But it takes making that choice for that extraordinary, miraculous change to happen. If you don't make that choice, it is by definition unjust. It's just an unjust world. But if you do make the choice, suddenly it's the means to your liberation. Suddenly it's transformed. Now, of course, in many traditions, this understanding can be found. Obviously, there's the idea of alchemy, you know, or the idea of you know, there's a poison and you make it into medicine, and so on and so forth. But I won't labor those. But you can see that that's radically different. It's a much more profound conception of the nature of the world than merely saying everything is for your own good. Because unless you've said yes to this other inheritance that's yours, unless you have said yes to it, it's just a terrible, horrific shit show. That's what it is. So if because you often find, do you not, you mentioned the caricature of the New Age thought around, you know, everything's for your own good. So you get cancer in your leg, and it's like, that's for your own good. You brought it on yourself, didn't you? It's only part of the providential nature of the unfolding of your eternal destiny if you've said yes to this other inheritance. If you haven't, it is by definition unjust. There's nothing providential about it. And I think that that's what can I say? It's important to recognize that fact. Otherwise, you do end up spouting New Age offensive drivel.
Another way of navigating that terrain that one hears, and I interview people and I hear people say all sorts of things about life circumstances and how it relates to the path and so on, is actually shit happens.
Yeah.
8 worldly winds, there's loss, gain, pleasure, pain, praise, censure, fame, infamy, etc. And these are just the winds of samsara, as someone might say. And actually, the need to see them as just or unjust is somehow a trap in itself. Now, I'm sure you've heard that many times and thought of that. So I'm curious, this is another way of relating to life circumstances, I think. What do you make of that, and how does that fit in with what you've been saying?
I think a slightly more nuanced view might be required to account for all of the details. So it's not simply the case that shit happens. Shit does happen, but you will, if you pay attention and you allow what you encounter, whatever it is, to disclose its own nature. Right? Allow the darkness to disclose its own nature. It has an intelligence of its own. It comes out looking something like this. You meet a darkness commensurate with your with the consciousness that you can bring to it. So there's an appropriate level of challenge, if you like. That might be another way of putting it. So we've come here to find something that's upside down and turn it the right way up. Right, by degrees, with increasing intensity throughout the course of our lives. You could think of it that way. So at first, I mean, it looks to us like we're interested in our own salvation. We're interested in finding what what I've been longing for. How do I get away from this unjust world? How do I realize what I care about? Sometimes I just want to get rid of my own problems, something like this. And maybe you go through that process. Let's say you have an awakening. Let's say you start guiding others, and it's like your circle is enlarged. So it's not just you anymore. Now it can include others. But it's exactly the same dynamic, except now there's a larger capacity for accommodating more of the darkness. Right? The problem that's come down the pipeline is bigger, right? But it's appropriate. And now you can turn that the right way up. And then you're going to get something else coming down the pipeline, bigger still, and you're going to turn that the right way up. It's always an invitation. I talked about being held in place, that kind of a thing. But it has to be understood that you've said yes to that, if one has said yes to it, right? You've said yes to it. It might involve suffering. It might involve frustration and difficulty and so on. But that's part of creation. There's a difference if you've not said yes to it. If you've not said yes to it, it's just a horror show, isn't it? If you've said yes to following the thread, if you said yes to the silent knowing, we get the unfolding of a destiny, and it's happening here, which means this world is being changed, right, by degrees, in an appropriate manner to the extent people have said yes to it. So I don't want to promote any delusions about, a universal awakening of the human race on the planet or anything of that nature. Rather, I think the old traditional understanding is the better orientation, which is there always has to be a number of people doing this for creation to be maintained. If there is no one that does this, then creation falls apart. This is a very old understanding, magical understanding. It's the point of magic. It's the point of you'll notice in the old traditions, in their mythologies, the first thing that gets created is magic, and it's magic that's the word that's responsible for holding everything together. And so there'll always be a few people who do this. and it kind of suggests, doesn't it, that the idea of everyone doing it is a misunderstanding of the nature of what's going on. But there's another way of putting this, which is, if you're called to it, then it's happening, and you get to say yes to it, right? If there is no call there, no amount of moving around appearances to give the impression of a change will make up for that absence. So, like I said before, you can get many people who appear to be doing it, right, but they're not doing anything. They're there for other reasons.
You mean they appear to be following the thread, doing spiritual practices of various types, doing magic, if that's their thing. What is it from Princess Bride? I do not think that word means what you think it means.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Where do the Black Brothers fit into this? This is a concept that you've written about in Camel Rides Again, and you've spoken about in various contexts. You've talked about, you've named some Black Brothers, Stephen Batchelor, Sam Harris.
Yeah.
Where do they fit into this? It doesn't seem that they're quite in either camp somehow.
A Black Brother is I mean, it comes from one of Aleister Crowley's visions, where this phenomenon is described. And as is the case with Crowley, over the years, I've shifted from the position of thinking about some of the things he said as merely flowery, niche things, peculiar to his path or something like that, to recognizing that the structure of things that he describes is universal, and that these phenomena are not as rare as you might think. So all a Black Brother is someone who has said yes to going along this path. Let's say they've had an awakening. They might already have had an awakening, or they might be approaching one. So either pre or post awakening, when the reality, they're approaching what appears to be the reality of the realization, right? But really, it's always the shadow of what comes next, which means it's the opposite image of what they think they're approaching, and that's a challenge. That's a challenge you have to travel through. They decide that they don't want to go any further. They say, "No, I'm not doing this anymore." Unfortunately, once the process is in place. Once the process is on, it's going, right? It has a momentum to it. Unfortunately, it's going to keep going in that direction. So if I'm approaching awakening, let's say I get some glimpse of awakening, I have to deal with its shadow. What do I mean by that? I mean, there may be the sense that in that direction lies the end of the self-annihilation, being torn apart into pieces until there's nothing left. Right? You get sweaty palms. Maybe you get unpleasant energetics along with it. There are all these different things that can come along, and it's challenging. You see, it's even more dissuasive than seeing Crowley's face in a book and think, that's the thing I'm after. Right? It's even more dissuasive. It's like, you sure you're going to want to go in this direction? Some traditions talk about fear of God. This is another example of it. Sometimes it can be the fear of being insane, going insane. Like, I think that I'm going to be subsumed within this overwhelming force, alien force, right? That isn't me. I'm going to be subsumed within it. Will I still be me? Will I still have a personality? When you read some of the descriptions of awakening, you can see that they're colored by this experience to a certain extent. Sometimes there's some unfortunate language around it, and that can feed into you entertaining this kind of drama. I mean, basically, you could say it's a fear of a nothing, right? Or it's being lost within everything. And either way, you're always a something. That's a beginning or an end, right? And you're approaching it. And this is where the path has led you. And you thought it was going to be all roses, spiritual enlightenment and bliss and so on. Yeah, so at this point, if you say, no, I'm not going any further, that's indulging the drama, right? Which means you get what you ask for, so you'll stay there, and it will be a long, drawn-out, painful, horrible process of being torn apart into pieces. The unfortunate aspect of this dynamic is that the person doing this will then speak on behalf of the tradition, right? And turn the whole thing upside down the wrong way around. Which is something that It's very peculiar. It's very peculiar. That's something I just cannot tolerate. I cannot tolerate someone speaking on behalf of awakening. I'll just put it that way, where they're lying about it. They're either lying about it or misleading people about it. You know, as a real possibility, something like that. That really gets me. I can't deal with it. Anyway, it's an unfortunate outcome to the thing that I'm talking about. And there's a level of burying what one has encountered, right? So there's a desperation and even if they look outwardly like they're calm and collected and so on, there's a deep psychological need to bury what it is that they've glimpsed and to definitely move in the other direction. So the lying about awakening or the turning of everything upside down, it's self-serving in terms of preservation more than anything else. It's not that I think that they're that they're evil and they want to lie to you, for your detriment. It's more like a desperate self-preservation strategy that's unconscious. I mentioned Sam Harris and Stephen Batchelor not because I wish to be bitchy and dramatic, and cause drama and that kind of a thing, but because I've weighed this up. It's like, how do I should I talk about this? However, it's a real thing that happens in the world. It's extraordinarily common, and I think it's worth mentioning figures where you can see it in their own biography. I mentioned Stephen Batchelor. Here's a guy, he goes for it. Like he practices every day. He goes on a Son, Korean Zen retreat. He's doing his koans every day. Some kind of awakening experience happens, and he immediately does an about face. He does an about face and completely and absolutely annihilates the tradition of Buddhism and claims that the Buddha was merely a proto-secularist. And that awakening has nothing to do with the tradition. Spiritual experience has nothing to do with it. And this is someone who's platformed by all of the major Buddhist institutions. So people go on retreat to learn Buddhism and they're learning it from this guy. I think there is value in me mentioning that. The same thing with Sam Harris. Same thing with Sam Harris. This is someone claiming to speak on behalf of the tradition, and they've turned it upside down the wrong way around. You can't entertain these secular, I'm going to say pseudo neuroscientific views that he has. You can't hold on to those beliefs after a certain degree of realization, because it's too miraculous what starts to unfold. You can't hold on to it. If you want to keep those beliefs, then you're going to stop. And that can be after an abiding non-dual realization. You could talk about it as full awakening. Some people do. You can stop there and not go any further and keep those beliefs. If you go any further, you can't keep those beliefs. They're going to go out the window. So what can I say? I'm saying I think of my role as shedding light on a situation. If I'm going to point out a structure to you, either it's there or it isn't, and you can look for yourself. But you need to understand that it's a real thing that exists. And the antidote to preventing yourself becoming a Black Brother is some means of making what I'm talking about conscious in your own experience, knowing when you're encountering the shadow that I'm talking about, and then how you travel through it. But the first step is to recognize that what you're encountering is the opposite of what will happen with realization. It's the opposite. So instead of, let's take self-annihilation, instead of a slow, steady demise until you disappear, right? The opposite of that, you might say, is a continuous growth or a outpouring, an abundant expression of eternal life. That's what's real. That's what you get with the true transmission of an awakening. And it's opposite in nature to the shadow that you encounter. So as a first step, if you recognize I'm supposed to be experiencing this, it is opposite in nature. So if it's bad news, the realization is going to be good news, right? But then how do you travel through it without indulging the drama? And then you need an orientation or a practice for that.
When I think of your example of Stephen Batchelor, and I think of his life,
yeah,
and his own
account of how it was he came to his particular conception of Buddhism and the path and so on. As you know, he was ordained in 1974 as a Tibetan Buddhist monk. And if I recall correctly, he was initiated into various different practice lineages and had a daily requirement to practice certain number of things, certain number of mantras, visualizations, sadhanas, etc. And these initiations often come with a daily requirement with fairly severe threats for letting out lapse of various types. And if I recall correctly, and I may be not recalling quite correctly, just one day he was feeling this tremendous pressure of having to maintain all this. And he was a young guy, and he realized he'd got himself into this situation. And he just suddenly saw it as entirely absurd and, in a sense, rejected the whole premise of it. And then left that tradition, of course, and as you say, went to Korea. There's something in there. There's something in what happened to him at that age. Do you have a thought about that? I certainly do.
Well, just to make sure I understand what you're asking, what would it ruin it if you told me what your thought is?
I doubt it. No.
Okay. Well, I don't know if this is what you're speaking to, but from the angle of the requirements for the path, right? For the reality of the path, for engaging with it, is it? Are you touching on the necessity for that kind of institutional relationship with it?
I have sympathy. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't actually have a particular position on whether he's right or wrong and where he's ended up, or anything like that. I'm not coming from necessarily an agreement with your position that he's a black brother or something like that, right?
Yes.
But just looking at his biography as a sort of Muggle person, I do feel sympathy.
Yes.
For this young guy getting in over his head is I think how he describes it. Yeah. And all of them in the rush and enthusiasm, and they were welcomed in also, and there was a bit of naivety, I think, on both sides.
Yes.
As to the on his side, he didn't know what he was getting into, and I think on the other side, this apparent passion and enthusiasm, and then welcoming in, not really recognizing that these people didn't really know what they were getting into.
Yeah.
So not apportioning blame or anything like that, but I do feel sympathy for what an awful position he must have found himself in.
Yes, into your description of. So let me just say this. Again, the purpose of me mentioning those examples, it isn't to label someone as something, right? Or it's what's the relevance to you? What's the relevance to you? Is to realize that these things exist in the world, and then how you would navigate that. What it would mean to navigate it. And it's very common. So this is something worth keeping in mind if you were going to teachers looking for guidance. Well, what if you come across someone who wants to move in the opposite direction to you? Okay, so again, I'm not making a judgment about the choice they've made, but you should at least know what's being presented to you, what's in front of your face, and why people might say some of the things that they say. So that's basically it. Yes, in terms of getting in over your head, that kind of a thing, I do have sympathy with that. I think that you can, because I believe he was a very earnest, passionate young man, right? I recognize that, doing the best that he can, and I think he's probably right in his assessment that he's in over his head, and attempting to conform to something that is not essential to what it is that he was looking for, right? In any way, shape, or form. But also an added component to that is that it's an institution that's part of a wider cultural norm, a wider cultural expression, right? Belongs to a different civilization. And I think it's not appreciated to the extent to which we have a parody of various different Eastern ideas of what awakening looks like, right, or what's required, um, and the extent to which there's a bizarre acting out of those stereotypes, uh, not only by students but by teachers as well. I'm mistaking some of those elements as essential. Does that make sense? Have I been clear with what I just said there? Is that yes? So I mean, I'll give an example. So, or rather, I'll start with the cultural thing. Tibetan Buddhism, because we're using that as the example, right, from the story, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of Tibetan culture. If you're Tibetan, you grow up surrounded by it. You have like all your language is informed by it. The music, the way you eat your food, the clothes that you wear, the structure of your society, the whole thing is informed by it. So by the time you might decide that you're going to take your vows and do that kind of a thing, there's an element of an organic or unconscious disposition towards it, right? Where it probably means something else than what it might mean to you, coming from a different society that has its own unconscious orientation, for better or worse, right? And the mismatch between those two things. So, there's another way of putting this, which is there may be a strange pathological thwarting of unconscious impulses that may not be the case for someone who grows up in that culture, right? But is necessary to someone who's grown up in a different culture. If that makes sense. So I think we see that clash. You see the enthusiasm of like early pioneers of people going to these traditions, and then the enthusiasm with which they're met, and a kind of naivety about what might come out of that experiment, if we can use that term for it. And I think he was that shows a degree of self-awareness, a healthy self-awareness, and about I've put too much of a burden on myself. I've accumulated all of these responsibilities or duties, and it's too much. It's detrimental. It may be that if he was Tibetan, he wouldn't have felt the same pressure for the reasons that I've talked about. Now, in terms of the caricature stuff or the stereotypes, you still see it now. People, let's just be generous and say, and I give an example, we have someone who's a deeply realized human being who's a teacher. They still do this thing where they sort of sit quietly on a chair, and you are at peace. You are at peace, and you're going to talk in a very slow, deliberate fashion, and you're supposed to be laughing all the time, or some like you're privy to some cosmic joke or something. There's I mean, you see some of the more distasteful stuff is where I'm actually thinking of someone like Papaji or someone like that, where they sit on a throne and they've got their white socks on and there's people kissing their feet and this kind of a thing. None of this has got anything to do with awakening in any way, shape, or form. They're cultural institutions. They have a place in their culture to accommodate what is essentially an unknown element that you might even describe as dangerous, right? It's like, how do you accommodate it? What do you do with it? What do you do with the guru? What do you do with someone, with the weirdo, right? Who's speaking on behalf of God. And around this person, strange and miraculous things occur, right? What do we do with those people? And I think that's been accommodated in certain tradition, in certain cultures, in a way, obviously, that doesn't exist in our culture. That's not to say then that what we should do is attempt to parody those cultural institutions in the West. We've seen that, though. We've done that for some time now. We've seen the culture, the spiritual car crash of 20th century non-dual teachers, is testament to that. And I think if we can disentangle the two and recognize these things, again, it may save you time in placing a burden on yourself or on certain ways of behaving, as the means to your realization that is, it's a case of mistaken identity and isn't essential.
But Adida does have something to do with awakening that somebody like Papaji doesn't. That's a very curious thought.
Can you say more? What do you mean?
Well, you previously used Adida as an example of somebody who had presented himself in certain way, in a seventh stage realizer and etc. etc. I'm here to demonstrate and so on. And this recognition, which you said is a sign, one of the signs to look out for in an authentically awakened, mature teacher. At a certain point, they're able to see that. Yeah. So that's, I think, that in itself is just he's quite a controversial example to use for that, and I'm curious as to why you've done that. But now you're also drawing in some. You're saying Papaji with his white socks on the throne and so on, and all that has nothing to do with awakening. And I'd say he's probably a less controversial person to gesture towards as having some kind of awakening. So you've almost inverted what I suppose what one would naturally expect.
Yes. Well, okay. So with Adida, we have someone explicitly teaching Guru Yoga as the means for realization, right? This is something that he gets from his teachers. There's this cross-pollination from the east to the west, and this movement is a real movement that happens, with the living tradition. It goes where it wants to go. It doesn't recognize east and west. It goes where it needs to go and does what it needs to do. It gives rise to traditions, exterior traditions, if you like. That's what it does. Adida, he teaches this Guru Yoga, but I'll use the example of the seventh stage realization. Right, so he has his description of stages of realization. It's like he keeps adding more, and there's this top one, the seventh one, where he claims he's the only person to have realized that seventh stage realization in the history of the human race. Right, he's the only one. None of his students get there. He beats every other teacher. He's the greatest of all time. Right, just him on his own. Also, he's the only one, he's the only means, right? And then when he dies, there won't be a successor. It's still just him. Now you could look at that and say, wow, there's some egomania going on there. He's made a category for himself and put himself in it and said there's only he is there, right? But here's the thing: if you do Guru Yoga, and he was no fool. So if you do Guru Yoga and you realize you have the right relationship with the teacher, and you come to realize what appears to be coming from the teacher, the thing that you're looking for, and you experience this as transmission, it resolves, right? That process resolves with recognizing you have the same nature as the teacher. And nothing about the teacher limits or determines that nature that's been realized. So it's just two people, stood in the same vast ocean of consciousness. How many of those are there? Right, you might say that there's one. There's one. So was Adida wrong or right to say, because you could look at it from the perspective of the human being, from the practical perspective, and say there's one person who's reached this level of realization and no one else is going to get there. And from that perspective, you would say there may be some problems here. However, from the esoteric perspective, right, there is only one degree of realization that involves, you might say, one person, capital P, right? And if Adida is presenting himself as that person, then there is just him. Does that make sense? Right? So which one is it? What perspective is he talking from? Who's speaking? I think that's always something people should keep in mind when they read the words of a teacher. What perspective are they speaking from? So there's an ambiguity there.
There's an ambiguity there. And you'll note as well that he's very dissuasive. He's very dissuasive. He's so dissuasive. Like, people will say a lot of things about him, but if you ask them, "Have you done the practice? Did you get a picture of his beautiful face and some beads and say, 'Beloved, die, surrender'? Have you done the practice? Have you tried that?" Now he's dead, so he can't, he can't harm you in any way. Have you tried it? And it's surprising the number of people that don't do it, including Adyashanti followers, by the way. You can go to an Adyashanti center and people won't know what you're talking about if you describe the method and the experiences, which speaks to what I was touching on before about you can't tell by appearances who's doing the real thing. So that's Adyashanti. Okay. Why did I now with Papaji? The reason I would say the reason I mentioned the white socks and the person kissing the white socks and all of this stuff. For me, Papaji he was more of a conventional teacher. He's and I would actually also say not particularly sophisticated. A guy who experiences awakening in the presence of Ramana Maharshi. Doesn't have the same training as Ramana Maharshi, can't speak to the text in the same way. And then these Westerners come, and there's this mismatch between the two, and it's a certain generation of Westerners with their enthusiasm, and the other complicating factors that come with that generation, and there is something. What can I say? There's something amiss there. There's something amiss there that is not the same with Adyashanti, because Adyashanti was a Westerner. And he was of that generation. And in many ways, he exemplified some of those characteristics that I'm talking about. So this isn't to dismiss any of the things Adyashanti did. He did some extraordinarily stupid things in the Garbage and the Goddess period. And you wouldn't be completely inaccurate if you said, he gets increasingly disappointed and contracts and disappears onto his little island in Fiji, wherever it is, sets himself up as the only one and then and then dies. There's an element there that's true. You can see that that's true there. For the Papaji thing, I see someone enjoying the attention from this generation of Westerners who come. He enjoys being in the position he's in. There is a lot of baggage there that doesn't need to be there. That I think is nonsense. That doesn't need to be there. It would have been better if Papaji said, "I am the only way. I am the only one with the highest degree of realization, and if you want that realization, you need to work with me, do guru yoga." I think it would have been better if he'd have done that, did an Adyashanti, and went in that direction. Instead, it's like this prototype for the wishy-washy non-dual stuff you get in the West with people. They have an awakening and then they just start teaching, and they sit on a chair and they say similar things and they don't really know what's going on, and they just talk. I don't want to be, what can I say? Let's put it another way. I believe that we've started, we've got this thing going on in the West, right? We can't get any lower. Maybe we can start to cultivate things and get a bit more sophisticated, and a bit more serious about what it is that can happen in those situations, how we navigate those things, what we can expect, what isn't essential, what is. And then finally, I mean, speaking to the naivety, there was and the superstition that can go along with this stuff that rarely gets challenged, especially in that enthusiastic environment that we're talking about. I mean, when Andrew Cohen had his awakening with Papaji, Papaji gives him a scroll with the names written from the Buddha, all these awakened people with Andrew Cohen's name on the bottom, tells him he's the one he's been waiting for, tells him he's going to make a revolution amongst the young, and so on and so forth. That is the worst thing you could possibly do when someone's just woken up. It's the worst thing you could possibly do. And and I think that comes out of a certain, a certain, what might be the word for it? This view that certain Westerners have about the East, and vice versa, I suppose. I feel like that perhaps I haven't articulated clearly enough what the difference might be, but I hope I'm, I've pointed at it. And it's okay if I haven't.
I think I can divine your meaning.
Maybe another way of putting it is just this. I can see the stuff that I might find distasteful about Papaji sat on his chair with his white socks on and a woman crying and kissing his feet because she's apparently had an awakening. Apparently. But he's happy for it to look like she's had an awakening. As is everyone in the room. They're all happy for it to look like someone's had an awakening. Right? That elements of that you certainly get with Adida. Like the people, if you watch any videos with Adida, you'll hear people moaning in ecstasy. Right. And I can tell you from people that were part of that community, like 70% of them are just making noises because everyone else is, so it's still, there's still that, but it's not really that I'm, why I highlighted each of them at the time I did in the conversation. Yeah.
I think I understand what you're saying. I didn't expect you to bring up Adida. It's very interesting indeed. And it sounds like you've taken quite an interest in him.
He's turned up.
Yeah, I was about to ask you that question.
Yes.
So, the thing about Adida is that it is this sort of guru yoga, as you point out. Yeah. And there's a promise that if you, incline yourself in his direction, you call on his name, you orient yourself to him, then he will appear. That's his claim. And the practice devotion to Adida, very simple, very stripped down, not 100 miles away, I think, from what you've arrived at as sort of the essence of the knowledge of the Holy Guardian Angel kind of working, that sort of encounter, that devotional core, in a sense. It's similar, I think, in some ways. I'm not saying it's the same thing. So I did.
Yes, well, that saved me from Andrew Cohen. Shall I explain that?
Yeah, I have one more sentence and then you can do both.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should start there. But
okay.
So have you done, it sounds like you have you done Adida practice? And you're nodding, of course, what encounters have you had with him, etc. So I'm very curious about that. And you also, you're telling me it saved you from Andrew Cohen. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a matter of biography here that makes a difference. So I'll start with the Andrew Cohen thing first. So back in the 2000s, whilst working on the Baptist Head with Duncan, we're exploring all of these practices, reading all the books, doing all of that stuff, dipping our toes into practical Dharma. And then I hear about Andrew Cohen. Here's a teacher who people wake up in his presence. It's transmission. Practical Dharma, that culture is skeptical of that transmission, but I'm afraid to say that speaks to the degree of realization involved.
You can't leave that unexplained.
Yes. Well, there's a degree of awakening. You could describe it as abiding non-dual realization. Doesn't change, right? You've realized the thing that you were looking for. You might think you're done. You might use this language. You could sit on a chair and be all floppy and loose and you could do all that stuff. However, people may have noticed there are these stories about some teachers where transmission happens, where people sit in their presence and they wake up. They have an awakening experience. Why doesn't that happen with every teacher? What is it that's going on? I can tell you from my own inner experience with transmission as a teacher that you can have an abiding non-dual realization. It's the thing you've been looking for. However, there's no or very little transmission with other people who are interested. There's another awakening that will come along. There's always another awakening that comes along until awakening isn't a question that arises anymore. But there's a degree of realization that comes along where you can't hold on to secular beliefs anymore. I mentioned it before when we were talking about Sam Harris. And it's a degree of realization that when that's happened, transmission becomes a fact. transmission becomes a fact. And that's the trajectory, right? And even more so, past that degree of realization. So it becomes very easy. It becomes once you're familiar with the structures that I'm talking about, it becomes very easy to see what you're looking at when you look at a teacher or a tradition or a practice. You could say from what's being expressed, because it's like a demonstration of the content of the teaching. Oh, this person is here and they've stopped there. Or this person is going through this right now, or whatever, right? It is pretty simple. In my own experience, with Andrew Cohen, I'll talk about the Holy Guardian Angel. So for those people that don't know, Aleister Crowley's main practice was invoking the Holy Guardian Angel. You would invoke the Holy Guardian Angel and at some point experience union with the nature of the angel. As a shorthand, you could think of it as having a guru, right, who's not incarnated, a discarnate guru. You could think of it that way. It's a being, a realized being that will guide you through your life. But in the end, you'll discover that you are that being, right? You have the same nature. And so the practice is invoking that being. It will seem separate from you. You'll have experiences with it until eventually you realize you are it. It's the same thing. One of the virtues of this is that you can't be abused by your holy guardian angel because they're discarnate. And you don't have to give them your trust fund. So I'd started working with the holy guardian angel, and there's different ways of approaching it. So there's a full-blown ritual version that Crowley came up with. You can come up with your own ways of doing it. I adapted Father Thomas Keating's centering prayer from Christian mysticism for working with the angel. I've done it with sigils, different magical methods. But I'd started going through this process of evoking the angel, having contact with the angel, and then experiencing union with the angel. And then this repeats, but with ever deepening, more profound realization, so that the angel appears in a commensurate, symbolic fashion to represent the deepening of that understanding. So I think I went through like 7 versions of the angel, getting ever more profound with each presentation. So I was going through this process when me and Duncan decided to go and check out Andrew Cohen, because here's a guy, apparently people wake up in his presence. So we thought we'll just see if transmission is a thing. So now there's a funny story around that, which is I was a temporary office worker at the time. I went to an office and sat down to do some work. There was someone sat next to me. I started talking to her. Me and Duncan were going to see Andrew Cohen, I think that night or the next night, something like that. We'd already decided to do it. I started a conversation with this girl. It turned out she was one of Andrew Cohen's disciples, also a temporary office worker. She hadn't seen her husband for 5 years because the sexes had been segregated. And they lived by moving around the world, renovating buildings and so on, going where they needed to go. They were also paying, exorbitant fees to Andrew Cohen at the same time whilst working these part-time jobs. Anyway, it was a funny coincidence. Then I go to the talk with my friend Duncan, and we sat in the audience, and Cohen comes out. He speaks spontaneously, right? He does a good job. He touches on what he touched on. How can you live a human life without ever tackling the question, like, who and what am I really? And what is this about? Right? Isn't that something that you should try and resolve whilst he's still alive? And he spoke about that very earnestly. He's an impressive speaker. And we're sat in the audience, and a long story short, because it unfolds, there's lots of detail in there, but a long story short is we both experienced transmission. Let's just say certain states arose, right, and they persisted for some time after, and some growth had happened, but it wasn't full-blown awakening, right? It hadn't completely resolved the search or the longing. We went back another time just to try it out again, And it was even less so the second time. But during that experience, where I started to experience the transmission, I was experiencing what I was looking for, this divine nature coming from Andrew Cohen. This is despite his because I'm saying he's impressive and so on, but the whole thing was I still found the whole thing kind of dissuasive, you know. So despite all of that, I was experiencing this force, this reality coming from this man. And as I'm experiencing this change in state, at that point, I suddenly recognized, oh, this is my angel. And it was the same nature as my angel. This is what it is. They're the same thing. Hence my how I described it earlier. You know, like I was saying, it's like having a teacher, but there's discarnate. It's that nature. It was that nature. And I don't think I needed it to save me from Andrew Cohen, but it certainly drove home the point, which is I don't need to join Enlightened next, because that's the unfortunate name he gave what he was doing at the time. They had posters on the wall of like people skydiving into galaxies, and it was like the Universe Project. Like this is this is what it's about. But seeing that was a fundamental insight, you know, that helped me orient myself. I understand you don't need to buy into all of the trappings of a given group or teacher or something like that to engage with the real thing. And it kind of cross-validated both things. Transmission is real, so is the magical path, and there's no difference between those two things. They've got these two avenues. I would say the difference is this, though. There is something more expedient about a human teacher. Like, if I'm interested in transmission, I can just come and see you, right? It's harder to make contact with a discarnate being if you don't have the magical chops to do so. That's something you have to train in and acquire, and to a certain extent, you have to have a natural capacity for it, something like that. Okay, so that was my experience with Andrew Cohen. Okay, now onto Adida. So I go through the Baptist Head period, practicing magic, as Crowley described it, right? But from a chaos magic angle, if you like, so much more creative, that kind of a thing. There was less of a misunderstanding about what was essential for magical practice, you might say. Going through these states and stages, tracking them via various different traditions, doing the whole states and stages thing from Practical Dharma. Me and Duncan were active in that community at the time, people like Daniel Ingram and Kenneth Folk and so on. And we go through that process, and it culminates in us doing a magical working where I decided I was bemused by why no other magician had tried doing what Crowley did, which was talking to the Great White Brotherhood, right? The Great White Brotherhood is this idea of discarnate awakened beings who facilitate the unfolding of the destiny of human beings, who say yes to following the golden thread that I talked about, right? They guide the destiny of the human race. And so we did a working to contact this Great White Brotherhood. I thought, why not? Why don't we just try that? And lo and behold, someone came along, a being came along, and called Tempe, and he's the workings in all their excruciating detail are described in the Baptist Head book. We had silly occult preoccupations that you could say, they played a role in the workings, but he was always telling us something else. He was always saying, no, it's good news. Look to the future. And he was just concerned with awakening, with realization. That was it. And we got prophecies about when and where these and how these awakenings would happen, to the extent that I even got longitude and latitude for where I would be when I would experience, fulfilling the great work or awakening. It was the Bay of Bengal. That's where it was on a map. Later on, I would get married and travel the world. And I would end up in Tiruvannamalai. I would have a number of experiences with teachers. So I say teachers, dead teachers, I went to Sri Aurobindo's ashram. I experienced something there at the Samadhi where he was buried. But it all led to me going to Tiruvannamalai, going to Ramana Maharshi's ashram. It was an unfortunate experience. I won't go into that now. The ashram, I was about to give up with the whole awakening thing, as is the way, right? I've had enough of this. I'm sick and tired of the seeking. I'm sick and tired of the states and the stages and the practices and everything else. And that's when I saw a poster on the wall in the place we were staying for a guru called Arunachala Ramana, who gave satsang and just said he was awake. So finally, someone I can go and see. And so I went to see Arunachala Ramana. Ironically, I'm in India, but this guy was American. And in his presence, the path resolved. So I had my awakening, my abiding, non-dual realization, you could describe it as. And then I went to the Bay of Bengal and chilled out there for about 3 weeks. It's good to have a holiday after you wake up, I think, and just relax and enjoy yourself. So, yes, after that, I thought I was done. It's the end of the road. That's it. I've achieved what it is I was after. Okay. I come back from my travels. Alex asked me, would I guide him through the same process? Which I do. He has realization, and that's the beginning of my teaching. However, I would have as one amusing anecdote. Someone who was interested in practical Dharma stuff, they were taking the Theravada route. He came around to my flat and asked me if I could help him. But he was so close to this level of realization, same level of realization. He would sit with me. We'd start talking, and to all intents and purposes, he was just awake. Right? When he would leave the room, he would just dip back down again. And he was right on the edge, which made it extremely frustrating and amusing. However, it was minor. That was minor. If I was doing any other kind of teaching, no one was experiencing transmission or anything of that nature. It was only until 3 years later, 4 years later, when I was 33, that it really began. Now I can go into detail in a moment if you want, in terms of the nature of the realization that happened then, or the awakening that happened then. But needless to say, this is when what we might in Magia we would describe as ancestors began to turn up. That means dead teachers. And in 2019, it was even more so. But one of those beings was Adida. And there was a number of others. So that was my, it's not that I sought out Adida per se. It's more like the understanding of ancestors is that when we say yes to our inheritance from this other world, right? When we say yes to waking up, when we say yes to realizing who and what we really are, it's not saying yes to some vague, nebulous, neutral force or something like that. It's saying yes to something that's been contributed to by teachers throughout time, to realized beings throughout time. They've been through that process, but they've added to it. They've added to it. And that's what you're saying yes to. You're saying yes to that inheritance, but to a continuation of that same work. So you're always standing on the shoulders of giants, to use that cliche. So they're always the greater, right? You'd be nothing without them. However, you should be adding. Hopefully you add something to it, which is why you also find the amusing phenomenon of the teacher that always says they're the greatest that's ever lived. It's because in some sense they've added to what they've inherited. So, but the ancestors are always the greater. So, at some point, so Adida was already turning up. That was already a thing. It was a feature in my realization around that time. He was literally in the realization event that happened. But after that, I did try the method to see, because it dawned on me, everyone's reading the books and talking about him and saying all these things about him, but has anyone ever done the practice? And it's a peculiar thing to get a picture of Adida, particularly in his later years, and to be looking at that in a devoted fashion. And saying, beloved, dare I surrender. But the thing that he describes as the thumbs, right? Which is the sense of this force descending through the crown chakra into the body and experiencing transmission. This is readily available if one was to do that practice. And it's similar. It's taken on a form which is similar to doing working with the Holy Guardian Angel. You don't have to worry about losing your house and like being separated from your significant other to go and live in a commune somewhere, because the guru tells you to do that. They're dead, right? So you don't have to worry about anything like that. So what have you got to lose? You could just try it. It goes without saying that I wouldn't, as a discerning human being, right, as prey to the same delusions as everyone else, many of the teachers that I might talk about wouldn't be characters that I would have ideally chosen. Such as, Adidar or even Aleister Crowley, But it speaks to the reality of the situation and perhaps that there's a deeper mystery there as well that's going on. It wasn't till after that realization, I'll just say 2013, I said I started teaching and so on. But that's when transmission then becomes a factor. That's when, as a human being, right, as a teacher, you then have to wrestle with that phenomenon, right? So obviously the first thing that happens is this. You have someone comes and sits with you and you just talk with them and they start waking up. Well, holy shit, you must be someone special because someone's just sitting in your presence and they're waking up. What if you could control it? Could you zap someone across the street and just wake them up? Right? Can you be the great realizer? Is that who you are? Can you do that? And so on. So you have this inflation and you have this drama. What if it doesn't happen? What if people tell stories about it and then people come and then it doesn't happen? Right. So there's this drama that you find yourself in. And you can see you could get stuck there. You could cultivate that in a pathological way. But basically there's a fundamental misunderstanding happening there, which is transmission is, you could say it's the work of divine wisdom. It's doing what it needs to do. It has an intelligence of its own. If you could direct it, that's implying that that's absent. The phenomenon itself is absent. Like divine wisdom is absent. You have to make up for its absence. So I'm going to guide it. I'm going to tell it to work over here. I'm going to get it to work over there. Now, I'll just caveat this by saying there are methods where they might feature in a practice that looks like someone directing it. But that's downstream. That's more like making something conscious and demonstrating its content than it is any notion you might take from it superficially that it's being controlled in some way. Right? I just wanted to throw that in there, but nevertheless, any preoccupation with transmission, either as a student or as a teacher, is really evidence of being lost in a drama, an unnecessary drama or a delusion. Now, you do have to travel through it. You do have to travel through it without falling prey to it. But in the end, what happens is the question around transmission just disappears, just falls away, and you never think about it again. As a teacher, I never think about it, whether it's happening or not. You know when it's happening, and you can even tell when someone's woken up. But it's not you're fundamentally deluded if you think it's something that needs controlling, or something that has its origin in you as a person. If that makes sense. But it is, if it's understood to be what it is, and now I have students for whom they have to travel through that same drama because it's the trajectory of the path. It's the trajectory of the path. You need a way of orienting yourself, of making these things clear. It is a necessary part of it. You will have to travel through it. Talking about it and being honest about it is the best means of doing that. And that's the virtue, I think, of what, people call awakening porn. When you talk about realization and its nature, it should, I think, be in service to ensuring people don't make mistakes that can come down the road. If I'd started experiencing transmission as a teacher with students and someone had said, I've been waiting for you, You're the guy I've been waiting for. Here's a scroll with your name on. You know, you're the great teacher of this generation. You're going to create a revolution. You know, that might have made things worse rather than being helpful.
It's very interesting that you've come across this Adyashanti thing, and it seems like you've also interacted with some students of Adyashanti, which is also quite interesting, and done your homework in terms of his.
I was told off by an Adyashanti student when I was teaching in California, and I was doing the thing where you sit on the chair, you know, speak in a soft voice and so on, and there's the audience. And someone was asking me questions. The satsang comes to an end, and there was so it's an older lady. She was in her 60s, and she looked pretty stern. But she looked at me and she shook her head and she said, "You're too soft when it comes to these students." Like and what she meant was I was entertaining questions that perhaps I should have admonished the student for asking, as in they're besides the point, they're missing what's essential, that kind of a thing. So she said I was too, perhaps she was saying I was too kind or accommodating, something like that. But that is nevertheless, that is the way that I teach. Is that despite sometimes me thinking, I might say this in this situation. When I teach, I always find that I accommodate what the person is talking about, and then point them in the right direction. Yes, but yeah. So apparently, I'm not as robust as Adyashanti might have been with his students.
You know, he had his three typologies: solids, vitals, and peculiars. And are you aware of that typology? And if so, where would you place yourself?
I mean, I don't. Well, it might be more interesting if you. Where would you place me?
I don't think you're a vital, and you can't be a solid. So you must, by process of elimination, be a peculiar.
Yeah.
But only by process of elimination.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas Adyashanti was a vital. And so if you're talking about robustness and style and so on and so forth, that's a very relevant distinction.
Yes, if we follow his, typology.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But you see, there is the thing about teaching is that there is there can be a cutting truth, right? What can we say? I use that word robust or whatever, that cuts to the core of things, but it's presented in a way where you might miss that that's what's happened. And I'm thinking of a teacher like Adyashanti. Adyashanti appears a certain way. He has a certain kind of audience that he appeals to, but sometimes he says things that are that speaks to a certain kind of sophistication under the surface, and at a certain you could say it punctures. It would puncture certain delusions, but it's presented in such a manner that you don't even notice that the balloon's been popped. Yeah, and that's again, I don't know, how useful the categorizing of people might be in terms of understanding that dynamic.
Yes, perhaps not so useful ultimately.
The interesting aspect for me there is you can see with Adyashanti, and this happens with teachers with transmission, when transmission happens, is that, and Andrew Cohen, you see it with Andrew Cohen, initially students experience transmission, right? And they think this is it. It's happening, right? The revolution's happening. People experience awakening, they're experiencing transmission. Some people, though, can stay in the proximity of a teacher for a long time. As soon as they leave their proximity, though, it turns out that they're not awake at all. Right? It disappears. And then the teacher is forced to consider what is it that's happening and what is the nature of what's going on. Now, Andrew Cohen doesn't really get to grips with this. He doesn't really doesn't understand what's going on. He doubles down on his, what can we say? On his best guess of what it is that led to his awakening. I think Adyashanti is slightly more sophisticated, but you can see in the literature, he starts off by talking about these states and these energetic changes and so on as the point of the path. It's the point of the process. But after a while, he starts saying, no. I'm giving those as gifts. They're free gifts. But what's beyond them? See what's beyond them. You're not in the right relationship with me, right? And this is where you might say, if you're being cynical, this is where he starts to throw his toys out of the pram and he starts to isolate himself further and further until he's trapped on his little island. I find that interesting that there's a trajectory there. And I think it's a necessary one. And it doesn't have to be simply from the perspective of transmission, but from the perspective of looking at awakenings. I mean, the woman said just from the get-go with this one example, there was obviously her presumption was this is not how a teacher teaches. A teacher should be tearing someone down. A teacher should be there should be a challenge or there's some degree which must carry with it some degree of humiliation. That has to be in there in that kind of teaching. I mean, of course, you'll know this. There are teachers now who, independent of Adyashanti, their method is to, and people will pay to do this. They'll sit on stage with them and then have the person humiliate them in front of everyone. As if that's the method. This is how we achieve awakening. I'm going to humiliate you and squash you like a bug in front of everyone, and that will.
Gosh, that's fascinating. You mentioned then you had this other awakening at 33. Was it
yes.
33?
Yeah.
When Adyashanti showed up, and as part of that, and you said perhaps we could go back to that in some detail. So I'd be very interested in hearing about that.
I wanted to go back to that because, much like talking about Black brothers and giving examples, there is a virtue in talking about the nature of realization to the extent that it's useful for people to see that it's a reality, that it illuminates the structure, the objective structure of reality, for people to understand where they are and what's possible. Right, I believe that's a virtue. Perhaps it's conceivable that there could be a culture where we wouldn't have to do this, because it was a given and it was secondary to other concerns, which is probably the healthiest and wisest orientation. But unfortunately, that's not the culture that we're in. What I wanted to mention was what I think is it's important for people to be exposed to or see as a reality to these experiences, versus the usual view we get, which is like some kind of wishy-washy, nebulous realization of something in the third person, like a field of consciousness or something like this. And if you realize that, perhaps it's the same as turning your brain off, and that's it, and that's the state we're aiming for. When I was 33, after the realization, when I was 29 with the Guru, I thought I was done. But after a while, I'm guiding people through the same process, and I'm totally practical because that's all that's available. So I teach people a method. I get them to see the terrain that they're going through. There's tips and tricks you can use to help people wake up. When they're approaching awakening, they're often very close to exhausting the drama of waking up. There's things you can do there to exacerbate it. So I used to do things there to exacerbate that process. But I started to get this sense of being drawn towards something, like something was coming and I'm being drawn towards something. And I had an awakening. It came in more than one part, let's say, but it's over like the space of a day or 2 days, something like that. And I'll explain the most interesting part first. And it's appalling. was appalling. This it was appalling. One of the ways to try and describe the sensation that I've used in the past is this. If you imagine that you're going to the shop, right? So you're going to go and do something. You've got something you're doing, and you bump into a friend, and you start talking about something really interesting, and you get lost in the conversation. And then at a certain point, you remember what was you think, hang on, what was I doing? Oh yes, I was going to go and do this. I'll go and do that now. Right. That feeling was the most essential part of the realization. But the appalling part was directly knowing that the 33 years that I'd been alive, containing everything that we've actually talked about in this episode, in this podcast, right? All of the frustration and the suffering and the confusion and so on, right? All the striving and the seeking and all of that stuff. All of it meant nothing. All of it meant nothing. And who and what I am was finally here. Was finally here. It finally arrived. And it was as if 33 years, which for a human being can seem like an eternity of suffering, put it that way, right, meant nothing to it. It meant nothing to it. It was like in the blink of an eye. That's fine. If this is what we need to do what it is that I'm going to do, then that's what we'll do. And there was something appalling about that, about how it means nothing. The thing that you've just been through for 33 years that felt like an eternity of hell or whatever. It's nothing. But now I'm finally here. I'm finally here. It's like being in a dream for 33 years. And it's come to an end, and finally I'm here. Oh, this is what I was doing. Yeah, that feeling to it. So what do I take from that? It tells me that I came here with a purpose to do something. It also tells me that who and what we really are doesn't have the same kind of human concerns that we have. And I don't think that means that it's in a cold sense, in a dissociated sense. I don't think it means that. I think what it means is it understands the nature of this world and what it really is. And therefore, if you understand that it's that suffering arises from a case of mistaken identity, right, and that's a part of creation, you've said yes to coming here to encounter that precisely to turn it the right way up, or to do whatever it is that needs to be done. That's like an adventure that involves challenge, a kind of challenge that, no matter how bad it might be, ultimately cannot in any way impinge upon what that nature is. The essential of that nature is indestructible, and it's not subject to the conditions that this world would try and persuade you that you are subject to. Does that make sense? So there was that sense, I'm finally here to do what it is that I need to do. Finally, I'm here. It's as if before I couldn't fit in, and now what I really am is, it can be here now. Now, part of that, it was like a series of awakenings, but they were close together. Maybe you might think of it as an opening and then the full realization, something like that. It involved Adida. So part of the realization was being in an infinite white light with Adida. And he was dressed in an extraordinarily elaborate way. Look, everything you would want from an avatar. That's what he looked like. But he was as nonchalant as like we both stood at a bus stop waiting for a bus. Nothing was going on. He was just there. But then part of the realization was, and I say realization, and this is difficult to describe, but part of the visionary aspect was me realizing that who and what I am is the force that's responsible for every human being that's ever woken up. So I could see existence. I could see the source of creation, if you like, and then this action of the light meeting the darkness, and wherever the light touched the darkness, that was a soul waking up. And I was the origin of that activity for all human beings that have ever woken up. And that was what I might describe as the fountainhead. I came to describe it as that, or the source of awakening, or something like this. So you can see why it's appropriate Adida might have been there, because he very much talks about this this aspect of reality. And from that moment on, I began to cultivate something in my teaching work. Transmission would happen. I'd have to travel through that drama, which we've already discussed or talked about. And through a series of retreats, I attempted a number of times to express my best understanding of what awakening is, what the process is, and what it's about. But I always had this sense once I got to an expression that it wasn't quite it yet, and that there was more. And this went on for a number of years until an old friend turned up in a vision unexpectedly. And that was the being called Tempeh that I'd worked with during the Baptist Head era with Duncan. So it'd been a number of years. The whole approach to waking up in terms of magic had fallen away when I was 29. And I just wanted to understand what its real nature was, have an open and honest conversation about it. I tried doing that publicly and it was a bad idea. It just didn't work out. People, Zen and Advaita people, turned up en masse to say, stop talking. They didn't want anyone talking about it. It was very peculiar. This Tempeh turned up in a vision unexpectedly, I think at the beginning of 2019. Or maybe it was the end of 2018. Either way, it turns up and revealed in this visionary experience that he was actually the god Ion, the lion-headed god that's on the front cover of Carl Jung's book of the same name. This is all I knew about the god, is that he was on the cover of that book. And so I decided to go and do a magical working with Duncan, go and find Duncan. Duncan was on a casino retreat. And long story short, we did a magical working and spoke to the god Ion. And Ion made a prophecy. And the prophecy was, I had a secret that I'd never told anyone. And it was a dodecahedron. And there was some other stuff in there, but that was basically it. And it wasn't long after this that everything I'd tried to do in terms of teaching came apart. So I'd done the usual stuff where I mentioned going to California to you off the call, teaching. Back in the day, I did a lot of teaching in America on the coasts. You do the usual thing. You join the non-dual circuit. You know, you sit on a chair, you speak quietly to people. You have a book to sell. You go to the conferences, that kind of a thing. If you're lucky, you get some rich boomer students who will support you. Perhaps you put together a charity, and so on. And I'd got to the point where I had an opportunity to disappear, just work with some wealthy people, that kind of a thing. I knew, but the thing that I was following did not lead in that direction. I knew that wasn't it. This talking circuit thing is not it. This is not the work. It's leading somewhere else. I don't know where it's. Now, of course, part of me thinks that's unfortunate, but nevertheless, that's what it was. I even did the whole, I created an interactive gamified learning platform with 130 videos, and I had a research project that I put together. All the things that you might do to try and get something known or promoted in our culture, normalized, right? Try doing all of that stuff. But it just got to the point where all of that became exhausted and all of the problems with it became apparent, until eventually the process that I've been talking about that started when I was 33, it came to an end when I was 39. Everything that I'd done ran out. It ran out of steam. There was nowhere else left no avenue left to explore where I could do what I thought was appropriate in terms of teaching. And I'd ended up booking a retreat, running a retreat in Greece for a small group of people. I'd run out of steam. It was game over. And I thought, well, I'll still do the retreat because I've booked it and people have paid to go on it and so on. If I just sit there and have nothing to say, then that's what I'll do. I have zero self-consciousness in that regard. And I'll just have to do that. Before the retreat began, Adidar turned up again. Sri Aurobindo turned up. Some other teachers turned up. and they were gathering to support the work, what was about to happen. That might be the best way of describing it.
Who else showed up?
I'll tell this story. People can take from it what they want. On the retreat, just before it's about to begin, I was in my room, and I needed a chair to sit on, right? And there was a chair in the room, a white wooden chair, and I had a stick. I brought a stick because a stick had been in the Ion prophecy, right? It was a stick split at the top, and of course, as is the way, I go into this antique shop and there it is. So it's like, well, I suppose I better acquire that. You know, I don't know what for, I don't know what it is, but I'll do that. Okay. And I had other stuff with me, obviously, and I bought a hat to keep my head cool in the blazing Mediterranean sun, right? So I'm in my room and I think, right, I'm about to go out and do something, but I still don't know what I'm doing. I still think that this is just, I'm just going to sit on a chair and just see what happens, right? And then I'm in a different state of mind, and I look around the room, and I know that the chair that I'm going to sit on is Adida's chair. Like so I haven't lost my mind. I know that the chair is just happens to be a chair in the room that I'm in this venue, right? At the same time, a stronger impression is coming from somewhere else. That's Adida's chair. I'm going to be sitting on Adida's chair. And I looked at the hat and the stick, and I knew that the hat and the stick, they belonged to Aleister Crowley. Now, of course, the difference between those objects is that the chair was in the room, and it could have been any chair. But the stick and the hat are mine. Take from that whatever you want. And then I went out and sat on the chair, and after a while I began to speak. Now there's a video on my YouTube channel of that the first time I started to speak on that retreat. And I spoke, and then had a break, then I did the same thing again. And I think it was on the second day, maybe something like that, where I suddenly realized that there were 6 days, you know, and that would make 12 teachings of the dodecahedron. And the entire time that I was talking, of course, there's a different state of consciousness that's involved. But there was one drama that I was engaging with, that I was traveling through. And it was this preoccupation with who is speaking. Who or what is speaking. Sometimes I would think beforehand, oh, I need to talk about this. Right, so maybe I'd start talking about it, and you'd think that's like a person speaking. Sometimes I'd be sat there and I didn't know the next word coming out of my mouth. During one of them, I distinctly remember saying a sentence and being astonished at the sentence that I'd said. That's like someone hearing it from someone else, and it's new information. But it moved between these two, and I kept wondering who's talking, who's speaking. Now at the end of the retreat, that drama came to a resolution because it's the wrong question to ask, and that there's no difference between what one might perceive to be divine speech, or divinely inspired speech, something like that, and our messy human speech. You can't tell the difference between the two. But that's the drama that I traveled through. By the end of it, there were 12 teachings, and it was a book. And the only way I can describe the nature of this book is that it's a secret that I've never told anyone, and that it's what I brought with me into the world when I incarnated. Such that when I was 33, I recall, I'm finally here to do the thing I need to do. And then for that to seed and then grow and take root and produce fruit, it required a number of years of cultivation in the dark and the cold of Wales, rural Wales. And then I had to exhaust any preoccupation I might have as a human being and thinking I might be the source of a teaching or a way of understanding awakening. And then the book comes along. The book's called Magia. It's a very old word, just meaning magic. And you can see it's a return of what I started off with. Like Crowley's teaching, he called it magic, and it was an old spelling of the word, pointing to the past. And it's a similar thing, but you can see it's also different it's also different at the same time. But the process of waking up is by degrees the inheritance of the previous work of ancestors, and by ancestors I mean those people that have said yes to this inheritance from another world in the past, right? And they've died, and their degree of realization, if you want to put it that way, which is inseparable from the work that they've done, and they had to do it here, right? That's what you inherit. And it supports, but also continues the overall work of what we might describe as a tradition behind traditions, or the lineage behind lineages. It's what Crowley would have described as the Great White Brotherhood. In Magia, we just talk about them as ancestors. And then since 2019, I knew I had to care for the book, so I put it all together myself, did all the typography, published it on Amazon. I knew that I had to do that and make sure that it was done properly and presented properly. Yes, it appeared then, but it took a number of years of cultivation to inform that content. Following the same thread has led me since then to create a new branch in the image of Crowley's AA, his mystical or magical tradition. The instruction was handed down in a very particular institutional way, which he called the AA. It's currently that's called the Ordo Magia, but it's a way of transmitting the practices. I didn't want to do that at the time, but it's what I was led to do. Similarly, I've had to do work in other places that I didn't want to do. It was very dissuasive. And it's always the case that once I've done that kind of work, you can see what the point was to a certain extent. But as a human being, I don't have the wisdom to understand what the outcome is going to be, right? And that's part of the faith of following this silent knowing, or this thread. It's the same thread that then led me to delve into Crowley, and now to produce these works. The fact that the book got cancelled, and we touched on this before when we talked about friction, I'm still following the same thread, right? So I'm interested in where the thread is going, not what the appearances are telling me. But I have a spoiler, which is the teaching tells you the structure of reality and what you can expect. So in my view of things, as perverse as it might seem, it's good news that the book's been cancelled, because it means the reality is commensurate with what the opposite of what's going on would imply. Did that sentence make sense, what I just said?
Fully, yeah.
Yes. So now there's other crazier things I could talk about, like the language of the birds. I don't know if we have time for that, but I hope that what I've talked about demonstrates that there's the path of waking up is extraordinarily rich, but it's miraculous, and it's why I said before, you can go so far and still entertain certain beliefs, but after a certain point, you can't hold on to them. The idea of dead teachers turning up to give you an inheritance so you can continue a work that's essential to the nature of creation, it cannot be accommodated, in by merely thinking about the brain as a proxy for awakening.
It's very discrediting, in fact.
Yes. Yeah.
Where does the dark goddess come into all this?
Following the retreat where I delivered the book, I thought, as silly as I am, I thought, I'll do it again. I'll do another retreat, and maybe it'll be the same. It will be like being in heaven, and I'll say all these wonderful things, and it'll be extraordinary. Maybe that's it from now on. That's what will happen when I teach. So I did another retreat, same venue. The first one took part in spring. The first one happened in spring. The second one was happening in autumn, right? And from the get-go, it was the polar opposite. Everything about that retreat was damned in every conceivable fashion. And that marked the beginning of a number of years, I think it was like 3 years, of a descent into what we might describe as hell. And that aspect of the divine best understood as the goddess, or that part of the divine that stays with the damned, stays with the fallen world. Right, so if the Magia book was like the teaching of the true earth, or the teaching of this other world, right, where there is the possibility of growth, there's creation, there's fruit, there's cultivation, there's the unfolding of your eternal destiny, you know, all of this stuff, who and what you really are, these kinds of things. The necessary counterpart to that is where growth isn't possible, where nothing works, where everything falls apart, where the thing you just mastered, right, is now the most difficult thing, is now an impossible task, even though you just mastered it. And it's about how you navigate through that which is damned. What do you do? Now, I talked before about how when approaching awakening, it's like exhausting a preoccupation with awakening until there's no avenue left, there's no candidate left, and then eventually the drama itself falls away, and then you realize what was always the case. Traveling through that drama has this nature of accommodating yourself to the damned. If you're in a situation that's damned, and by that I mean nothing's going to work, right? If you keep trying things that you think will work, you're yet to engage with the reality of the situation, right? The exhausting of the awakening drama is like your refusal to accept that you're damned. You are never going to do it. You're not going to wake up. You're not going to make it happen. There's no amount of moving appearances around that will make it happen. It's not conditional, right? And you can tell someone that, and the first thing that they do is they then use that as a strategy for trying to make awakening happen, right? Oh, if I can, oh, okay, I'm going to act like that then. I understand that everything's damned, right? I'm going to take that attitude. It's immediately co-opted as a strategy for making it happen. And it's like you have to exhaust the candidates so that there's just literally nowhere else you can put your effort, and then you see what the truth is. So if you want to travel through what's damned, right, to the fruit at the end, one way of thinking about that is it's like descending into hell, and at the end is wisdom. Now, wisdom is a goddess. The early Christians called her Sophia. If she's at the bottom of hell, how are you going to get to her? How does the initiate get to the goddess? You don't get there through cultivation, through practice, through states and stages, through, you know, all of your cutting edge theories and ideas and the feeling of providence and all these other things. You get there when everything falls apart. That no longer works. It's inexplicable. It's almost like the changing of the seasons. The changing of the seasons. So how would you get to a goddess if she's at the bottom of hell where everything's damned? You have to do what the damned do. You have to be damned. In other words, you have no recourse. Nothing is left. I think this is best illustrated in those awakening stories or biographies where people have real life events where everything is taken from them. You know, like they get sick, or their significant other dies, or they lose whatever, they lose everything they've accumulated, whatever it might be, and they hit rock bottom, and then they wake up, then they have an awakening. I'm sure you've heard such stories before. It's a similar thing. It's when there's no room left for you to entertain the idea that you will be the origin of anything, especially the thing that you're longing for. The thing that you're longing for. So, the goddess, she's wisdom. She's also silence. You can think of her as awakening. How do you get to her? You have to be damned. Now, that's easier said than done. For the most part, people just will not give up. They'll attempt to plant seed and do farming in the middle of winter. They'll just keep doing it until until their tools break. And then they'll, oh no, suddenly it's spring. I didn't have to do anything. So for there are particular practices that are appropriate for spring, right? There are particular practices that are appropriate in terms of the god, if you like, the sun, and so on. But then there's a particular approach that isn't really an approach that's appropriate for the goddess. When nothing works, when there's nothing left, traditionally, and it's the oldest magical tradition, you lie down to die. You lie down to die because you've got nothing else left to give, right? That's what you do. And that's how you sink down with the damned into the underworld until eventually you'll reach the bottom where the goddess is. This process, this practice, you see it described by people like Aleister Crowley in a particular way, but very clearly with someone like Carl Jung. What's called active imagination, which really means the unconscious being alive. That's really what it means. And an encounter with that describes that process. Everything that you encounter in that process is dissuasive, right? It gets primal, it gets dark, and so on. It doesn't mean every experience you have is unpleasant. What that usually means is if it's pleasant, it usually means you're not paying attention. You don't notice that it's actually dissuasive. It will remove the delusion that following the silent knowing is the same thing as encountering pleasant experiences. It will clear up that misgiving for you, because we're prone to do that at the beginning of the path. When we start following the silent knowing, there's a sense of providence. We have all these wonderful experiences, synchronicities, different states of mind, that kind of a thing. And we think that's the same thing when it's not. Descending to hell to meet the goddess. People always want to know what her name is, but she's not to be possessed in that way. She's not speech, she's silence. Is the same thing, however, as redeeming her. Right, so that in the old story about Sophia, she attempts to create without God. And as a result of doing that, she births a monster. And that monster is the demiurge, or the god of this world, of a fallen world. And he terrorizes her. She's trapped, right, in this world. But she won't leave. She won't abandon her child, this demiurge. God intervenes, right, and sends a savior from another world, right, or a force from another world to descend into the fallen one. And that descent, that's the initiate going into hell to find the goddess there at the bottom, and by doing so, redeems the goddess. She's redeemed, and the fallen god, that offspring, it turns out is an impossibility. If we, as human beings, if we attempt to create without the creator, we mistake a shadow for that which we care about. We make a case of mistaken identity, and then we dance to its tune, right? We're trapped in delusion. We feel ourselves persecuted then by a monster. That's how it is, the god of this world. When we travel through a shadow and understand that it's the result of a case of mistaken identity, of drawing a false conclusion, right? And then we see that it's just a shadow. What do shadows matter? They don't mean anything. All they are is the evidence of the reality of the light. That's all they are. Shadows don't matter. The problem is when you take them to be the light, or you take them to be the reality, or you take them to be yourself. So what you discover then is that, the injustice that I was subject to, the evil ruler of this world, turns out was never true in the first place, except for my pretending that was the case. And what's left in its place is a nature untouched by the delusion or the darkness, that's pure. It's wisdom itself, it's silence, it's without boundary, no beginning, no end, eternal, and so on. This is the redeemed goddess. This is the redeemed goddess. It's why after the descent into the underworld to find the fallen goddess, the redeemed goddess is the same thing as the Virgin Mother, because she's that which is also responsible for the birth of the Savior in the first place, right? Which is what the initiate is. This way of understanding things is what followed the Magia book, and it involved going through what can we say? Going through a series of experiences that demonstrated this content, and it took a number of years. That's content, I'm sure, that will appear in book form at some point. But that's a brief overview of the nature of the goddess. Now, the goddess, there's a mystery, which is that the goddess is contained within the name of Ion. You get to say his name, but you don't say her name, because she's not to be possessed in that way, right? There's a magical formula, if you like, or a way of understanding the name of Ion that covers that. But basically, these two sides of the divine can't be separated from each other. But essentially, at the heart of the mystery, the center of the temple, you find the Divine Mother with the child. That's who's at the center of the temple. For people who are familiar with Dante, you see he does this in his Divine Comedy. The central mystery is not Christ being resurrected after his crucifixion, although that's in there. The central mystery is a human mother giving birth to a god. That's the central mystery, and she's at the heart of his presentation of esoteric Christianity. But it's much older than that, and obviously you find expressions of this fact or this truth in many traditions. The god Ion is it's not very well. The god is not very well understood, but part of his tradition is that he was born from a virgin mother. That, you know, and that the date of Christmas is not a coincidence. You know, it follows the same pattern. But Ion is sometimes depicted as the divine child. Ion can mean, you know, a child, or it can also mean eternal life. Right, but the figure of the divine child, or the eternal child, or as Crowley would say, the crowned and conquering child, you know, it's essential to this, to understanding the tradition.
I think that might be a good place to stop.
Okie doke.
I would like to petition you for a sequel. I'd like to ask you about the language of the birds, which you hinted at.
Yeah.
I'd also like to go over some of your previous writings. For example, look at some of the things you said in the Camel Rides Again.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Revisit some of that. You know.
Okay.
You can always say no, of course.
No, it's always interesting to do. My view of it now is probably unfounded. But my view is, I look back and I think I was in my 20s. God knows what I said.
Right. Well, that will be quite interesting, I think.
Yeah.
I'd also like to talk to you a bit about. Well, there's various different things. You've mentioned already the practical Dharma movement. As I know it is the pragmatic Dharma movement.
Yeah.
And there are some intersections there that I'd like to revisit, particularly from your where you're standing now, and a few other subjects too. However, there is one teaser that I can't quite leave for the sequel. You mentioned to me that you have an understanding of a particular perspective on near-death experiences and where they might fit in. Now, I'm very curious about that. We can leave it for the sequel,
okay,
or we can deal with it now. What's your preference?
well, what do you want to do? It seems like you would like to deal with it now.
Of course, that's certainly my preference. Yeah.
Okay. So I had the good fortune to have a student, still have them as a student and a friend, who had near-death experience. I don't like the term near-death experience. I think that's a silly term. But I don't know what the right term is. But someone who died and then came back, right? Because I don't think there's anything near about it. It was interesting that he came to me after he died and come back, right? He comes to me after that, and there's a puzzle for me, which is if you die and then you have the kind of experience that people talk about, what does it mean to come back? Like, what is the nature of this place, and how is awakening related to it? When people die and then they come back, why don't they retain the state that they talk about encountering here when they're here, right? How do they relate to each other? As far as I know, I've never heard anyone talk about this. I've never read any of it, seen any of it in the literature, or even anyone ask the question, really. And is there a difference? When someone does die and they come back and they're in a different state, is that awakening? Or are they different things? So these were natural questions that I had. And I'll stay scant on the details because it's not my story to tell. But I'll say the essential things, and I'm sure the person concerned would be happy for me to share the essentials. That's fine. The person died. They returned to the source of creation. This is how he described it. It's a source. It was as if the nature of this world. The analogy used was like it's like a dust mote on your shoulder. All the problems, everything else, you could just brush it off. Meant nothing. Of course, there's the cliche, which is anything that he wanted to know, he knew just by thinking about it. His shape, he was a sphere. He was a ball. Right. Now there's more involved, but basically it's the thing of he hasn't finished doing what he needs to do. Then he comes back. There's an amusing element which is he said he became aware of this really annoying sound. I was like, what is that noise? And it was really grating and annoying. And then he realized that it was himself and he was screaming because he was in pain and he was waking up from the experience. He thought that was funny. I think that's funny. Anyway, it was a very painful, challenging experience that he went through. And it was one version of hell that led him, to the experience in the first place. It was whilst recovering from what had happened to him, lying in bed, that he had an awakening. Right? He had an awakening. An awakening happened. So, first of all, there's something interesting there, which is he's been somewhere. He talks about having this wisdom. He can know anything he wants to know. Right? He's back. That's gone away. That's gone away. And now he has an awakening. So what is the relationship between these two different worlds? What does it mean to be a human being? What's going on? Now, after the awakening, let's just say that the path led him to my teaching. And then we started working together and so on. And he would say that since he died and came back, it's as if there are activities that you can do in this world where he knows he's aimed back at that source again. He can tell when he's aimed at it and when he isn't. Right. However, his experience is not the same thing as having acquired awakening, and he still needs to wake up, which implies that it's a feature of what he's here to do. Right. So he dies, he goes back to this place. No, you have to go back because you haven't finished what you need to do. Now, outside of thinking about people who've died and come back, it should be obvious to anyone waking up happens here. Right? There's this common thing where you have someone has an awakening, they'll talk about the thing that's been realized. They'll talk about the illusory nature of this world, something like that. But it's as if this world doesn't count. The illusion isn't a real illusion. Well, it's there. And why is it there? And why would you need to be here to have that realization? What is it that's occurring? So there's obviously some aspect to realization that's about acquiring something, if we can use that language, or producing something that cannot be done in some other way. It's not done in that other world where you know everything. Also, we can say for that process, it's required that you can no longer access that wisdom or that knowledge here in order for the process to take place. Does that make sense? So if you're in the other place with the source of creation and everything's amazing, right? You cannot wake up. It sounds silly to put it that way, but I'm putting it that way to point out that there must be a reason for waking up in this world. And what is it? Dying and coming back is not the same thing as being awake. Even having a relationship with that world is still not the same thing. I might say that what he's talking about when he's aimed at the source is the silent knowing. And that's already there in the Magia teaching. And in fact, the reason why he's with the Magia teaching as part of that lineage is that it makes sense, is that he said it's the only thing he read that made sense of his experience and how to relate to it, and then what the process was that he's going through. What led him to his near-death to his dying and coming back, he's now working with those shadows, traveling through those shadows with the Magia work, right? So there's something about that process that's important enough for us to incarnate. That's the purpose for us being here, at least as far as we could talk about with this person. And that's how they relate to each other. Now, there's I'll put another perspective on this. I know someone else who has died and returned more than once. Maybe it's the most number of dying and returnings. It's so awkward. Instead of saying NDEs, of anyone I've heard of, right? And this person is a magician, but they're also psychic. And now there's something else I'll add here, which is it seems to me, and it's in the case of the student that I've talked about as well. But every time I've ever met anyone or looked at anyone's story when it comes to dying and returning, especially when they do it more than once, but I think it's more apparent, there is an acquiring of something that makes something else possible here, right? And it's the most expedient way of going about it. And the kind of life that the person lives leading up to the dying, I don't know if you've noticed this, their biographies tend to be insane. Their life experiences tend to be very dramatic. If there was a fastest route to somewhere and it meant driving downhill and it was extraordinarily bumpy, and you're going to get injured on the way down, it's like they've taken that route to get to the near-death experience or the dying and returning, so that something can be then done. Something can be brought here from there, and then something can be done that wouldn't be done otherwise. A simple example of that, I once heard someone talking about how since they died and came back, they often spend time with people dying, and just sitting in the room with the person dying tends to put them at ease. And so it's very simple. It's very, it's a very basic thing, very simple. This person who is psychic that I'm talking about, when I met him, I had the distinct sense of being completely understood. So when I spoke with him, there was no, I didn't have to caveat anything or introduce anything or cushion what I'm about to say or anything like that. However, not awake, no awakenings to speak of. So it's not the same work, but there is the same perhaps the retention of something prior that meant there's a direct communication that's going on. Now, that also might have been facilitated by the fact that he described how he works psychically. And the language he used was that his holy guardian angel talks to your holy guardian angel, and it's them that are there having the conversation. Now, if we passed that as divine self, or that aspect of ourselves that's realized the divine, or something like that, then it would make sense that one would be completely understood, to the extent one is aware of that. Okay, so all of this to say that what is the purpose of waking up here? This is how it. Because there are other angles to this that I could bring in. I could talk about experiences that aren't to do with people who've died and come back, but I've mentioned that enough to say it fits in with this understanding, which is the other world, if we can call it that, the place where there is nothing absent, where nothing is missing, where your nature is indestructible, can't be touched, it's overflowing, no boundaries, no beginning, no end, etc. There's nothing that can be added to it. It doesn't lack anything. So how might we go about adding to it? How can there be change where change isn't possible? How can we add to it? If the nature in question is forgotten and is recovered in a world that's the opposite to its own nature, you end up with a unique appreciation, or a unique viewpoint, or a unique encounter with a nature that doesn't lack anything. This is true for everyone who wakes up. No path is the same, is it? There's a universal structure, but the particulars are always different. And that means something is produced, the nature of which is unchanging, right? But by virtue of it being planted in the soil of existence, right, and then being cultivated, that which is eternal is given a unique perspective. There's another way of putting it, which is it's the memory of, it's a unique memory that's accumulated. And that when a human being dies, it's like a harvest. We gather together the fruits of that incarnation, and it's added to eternity. It's added to eternity. Because what can you add to eternity that doesn't lack anything? Well, there's the memory. There's the memory of the adventure, so it makes it possible for there to be an addition to something that doesn't lack anything. And this is just as we cultivate eternity in time here, time is cultivated in eternity, and that's the relationship between the two worlds. I've talked about this from the perspective of waking up, but this is true for all human lives. It's why if you lose someone that you're close to, you only realize what they mean to you when they've died. Right. Now, often people have regret about that, and they think, oh, I wish I'd have said something whilst they were alive. But you're not capable of doing that. You can only see what they mean when the fruits of their lives, right, is gathered up with their death. And you see it for what it is. Oh, this is the totality of what this person meant to me. Right. And that's an addition to their soul. Right, and that's the way death is. That's the way incarnation is. So I wanted to bring that in just to say that there's no there is a purpose and a virtue to all life in that regard, and everyone participates in it to the extent that they're capable. Yeah, and that's even the case when someone goes in the opposite direction and no fruit is produced, and in fact their time is spent destroying the fruit of others, because that's another trajectory. Even then it's inescapable. The harvest is inescapable at the end. The memory of that adventure.
Alan Chapman, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.